Tonight, we step into a story that is not just history, but the heartbeat of humanity itself. We begin a journey from Exodus to 2025, the untold journey of the Jewish people's imagined, a people who rose from slavery to freedom, who wandered across nations for thousands of years, and who never let go of the dream of returning home. This is not only their story, it is a story of faith, resilience, and the unshakable spirit of survival. I will take you across that journey, from the prayers of Moses to the rise and fall of kingdoms, to exile, to tragedy, to hope, and finally, to the living story of Israel today. But before we begin, I have a small request. Just let me know. In the comments below, tell me, where are you listening from right now? Which city, which country, and what time is it for you as you press play? I love knowing where my voice travels and where my listeners are dreaming from. Now, settle in, take a slow, deep breath, and walk with me on this timeless road. The Nile River glittered beneath a scorching Egyptian sun, and feeding the fields, carrying barges of stone, and reflecting the towering monuments of Pharaoh's pride. Also, the Egypt was at the height of its power. Pyramids, temples, golden gods, armies that conquered nations. To outsiders, it seemed like paradise. However, beneath that grandeur changed into suffering hidden at the back of the walls of palaces and a long way from the eyes of kings. There lived a people who had been not free, the Israelites. They had been foreigners in the land of Egypt, their numbers multiplying with every era. And Pharaoh, fearing their strength, chained them in bondage. Their days began before dawn. Whips cracked, voices shouted, and men, women, even kids were marched to the fields, the kilns, the building sites. They made bricks of clay and straw, carried stones heavy enough to crush backs, raised partitions for towns they would by no means stay in. Egypt's glory was built on their exhaustion. Can you feel it? The sun burning their shoulders, the taste of dust in their mouths, the endless ache of muscles that never rested. They were strangers in a land that prospered from their pain. And yet, even in slavery, they carried something Pharaoh could not crush: memory. The memory of their ancestors, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. The promise that one day their children would inherit a land of their own. This dream whispered through their prayers, through lullabies mothers sang to children, through tears shed at night. But because the years stretched on, hope started out to thin. Would freedom ever come? It was then, at the darkest hour, that a child was born, and his name would be Moses, Hazrat Musa, peace be upon him. But his beginning was fraught with danger. Pharaoh, afraid of the Israelites' also growing numbers, had commanded that every newborn Hebrew boy be killed. And a mother, desperate to save her son, placed him in a basket and set him afloat upon the Nile. The river carried him not to death, but to destiny. The Pharaoh's daughter found a child and, moved by compassion, raised him as her own. So, the boy who should have been a slave was raised as a prince, and he learned the ways of Egypt, its language, its gods, its courts. But in his blood, in his heart, he remained an Israelite. As he grew, Moses could no longer ignore the suffering of his people. One day, when he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, something inside him broke. In anger, he struck the oppressor down. And though he had defended his people, fear consumed him. Pharaoh's wrath would be merciless. Moses fled into the desert. Years passed. Moses became a shepherd and wandering the wilderness, tending flocks instead of leading men, and he thought his story was over. But God had other plans. At some point, on Mount Sinai, he noticed something outstanding, a bush engulfed in flames. And yet, it did not burn. As he approached, a voice spoke, the voice of God. "Moses, I have heard the cries of my people." "Go to Pharaoh. Tell him, let my people go." Moses trembled. Who was he to stand in opposition to the might of Egypt? He became no warrior, no king. However, God promised to be with him. And so, with his brother Aaron through his face, Moses again to Egypt, not as a prince, not as a fugitive, however, as a messenger of freedom. Before Pharaoh, Moses added the phrases, "Permit my human beings cross." However, Pharaoh's heart became hard. He laughed, mocked, and refused. And so the struggle commenced. Plague after plague fell upon Egypt. The Nile became to blood. Frogs crammed the land. Locusts wolfed crops. Darkness swallowed the sun. On every occasion, Pharaoh promised launch, and on every occasion he hardened his heart. till the final plague, the dying of the firstborn. On that night time, the Israelites marked their doorways with lamb's blood. Dying passed over their houses, sparing them. However, in Egypt, grief rose like a storm. Pharaoh, broken at remaining, known as for Moses. "Cross," he stated. "Take your human beings and depart." And so, underneath a moonlit sky, the Israelites accumulated. Families, children, elders, carrying little however faith. They walked out of Egypt, not as slaves, however as a human being reborn. The second, the Exodus, became the pulse of Jewish history. However, freedom's path became not instantly. Soon Pharaoh's regret became to rage, and his armies thundered after them. At the beaches of the Red Sea, the Israelites had been trapped. Waves before them, swords in the back of them. Melancholy crammed the air. However, Moses, lifting his staff, known as upon God, and the waters moved. Partitions of sea rose on both facets, and a dry path stretched before them. Are you able to consider stepping onto that seabed? The floor still moist beneath your feet, the sound of dashing partitions of water roaring beside you, the concern and the faith mingling for your chest. They crossed. And while the remaining foot stepped onto dry land, the ocean crashed down upon Pharaoh's military. In that second, centuries of slavery ended. A human beings walked loose. But the desolate track changed into not clean. Freedom carried hunger, thirst, and doubt. The desert stretched without end, testing their persistence, their religion, their unity. A few longed for Egypt, for the familiarity of chains over the uncertainty of liberty. But at Mount Sinai, the whole lot changed. There, amidst thunder and fire, Moses received the Torah, the covenant among God and his people. It changed into greater than laws, it changed into identity, it changed into destiny. You are my people, I am your God. This covenant assured them, not to Pharaoh, not to kings, but to something eternal. The promised land changed into not simply an area on a map. It changed into a symbol of wish, of belonging, of a future. From then on, every prayer, every music, every generation could bring this reality. We had been slaves in Egypt. But now we are free. The Exodus changed into not simply and get away from slavery. It changed into the delivery of a people. A people whose tale of survival, religion, and identity could echo throughout heaps of years, from desert sands to modern cities, from the pyramids of Egypt to the world we live in today. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine. You are standing among them, the Israelites, newly freed, their ankles still raw from shackles, their shoulders bent from years of labor. Can you hear their breath? Can you feel the trembling in their steps as they walk out into the unknown? Some clutch children tightly, others carry only bundles of bread on their backs. Their voices whisper, half in awe, half in fear. Are we free? Or will Pharaoh come for us again? Moses walks at the front, a staff in his hand, his eyes fixed on the horizon. He is not a king with armies, nor a general with strategy. He is simply a man chosen to carry a burden greater than himself. And yet there is something in his presence, a quiet fire, a steady faith. His very steps seem to say, keep going. The God who brought us this far will not abandon us now. The desert receives them with silence. Imagine that silence, not the comfortable quiet of night, but a vast emptiness. No houses, no crops, no rivers, only sand stretching to the edge of sight. The wind whistles like a warning, hunger gnaws quickly. Children cry for water. Voices rise in doubt. Why did you bring us here, Moses? Was Egypt not better than this? At least there we had food. Moses listens, his heart heavy. Leadership is not glory, it is weight. Yet he raises his staff and once again wonders unfold. Bread, like dew, appears upon the ground at dawn and water gushes from a rock when struck. These are not luxuries, but symptoms and reminders that freedom may be hard. They are now not walking it. At night, a pillar of fire burns in the sky, guiding them forward. By day, a cloud shades them from the burning sun. Can you picture it? Thousands of families marching across endless sands, their path lit by something not of this world. It is no ordinary journey, it is a pilgrimage of identity. And yet, the greatest moment is still ahead. In the future, the Israelites accumulate at the foot of a mountain, Sinai. Thunder rumbles above and lightning cracks throughout the sky. The air hums with strength and each soul feels it in their bones. Something divine is ready to happen. Moses climbs the mountain alone. Hours turn to days. The people wait, restless. They build fires, tell stories. Some begin to fear he will never return, but then he does. And in his hands he carries stone tablets. Upon them are words, not just words, but a covenant. Laws carved not by chisel, but by the very breath of God. Here, Moses declares, his voice echoing, this is who we are. This is how we will live. No longer slaves, no longer wanderers. A people chosen with a destiny eternal. Imagine being there. Status shoulder to shoulder with your ancestors, listening to the One's commandments for the first time. You shall have not any other gods earlier than me. You shall not kill. You shall not steal. You shall honor your father and mother. These are not merely rules. They are the building blocks of a people's soul. From this moment, the Israelites are no longer just slaves. They are a nation in spirit, bound not by land or kings, but by covenant. The promised land lies ahead, unseen, but now it is more than a promise of fields and rivers. It is an idea, a dream that whispers through time, we belong, we are chosen, we are free. Can you feel the shift? The fear of Egypt fades, replaced by something deeper: identity. The Israelites may wander, they may falter, but they will never again forget this truth. And that truth will carry them across centuries, through exile, through suffering, through triumph. This is why Exodus is not simply history, it is memory. Every Jewish child, every prayer, every festival retells this story. We were slaves and God set us free. Even now, thousands of years later, in synagogues, in houses, at the competition of Passover, families accumulate around tables. They eat bread without yeast. They inform the story of Moses. They imagine themselves taking walks out of Egypt, because Exodus is not something that happened once. It is something that continues every time hope rises in the face of despair, every time freedom wins against chains. Kings and kingdoms, from wilderness to thrones imagine. The desert still stretching endlessly before you. The taste of freedom is fresh, but the bitterness of hunger and thirst, every step forward feels heavy. The people who once cried for liberation now whisper, was Egypt truly so bad? At least there we had bread. Moses walks among them, carrying a weight heavier than any stone, the weight of leadership. He knows freedom is not won in a single night. It must be built patiently, painfully, step by step. The desert is their teacher. Every dry dawn and star-filled night shapes them into a nation not of slaves but of believers. But let us walk forward in time. Generations pass. After Moses, Joshua leads them across the river Jordan, and there, for the primary time, the Israelites step into the promised land, the land of milk and honey. The dream their ancestors carried via centuries of chains and wandering. Imagine the joy, the disbelief. We are home. We have arrived. Yet home is never simple. To settle means to build, to farm, to defend. Tribes rise, each with their personal land, but unity is fragile. Enemies surround them, Philistines, Canaanites, Moabites. Without leadership, chaos brews. And so the people cry out, give us a king like other nations have. And history shifts. The first king is Saul, brave but burdened. His reign starts off evolved with desire, but leads to tragedy as doubt and jealousy consume him. Then comes David, the shepherd boy who once felled a giant with a sling. Can you see him? He is younger, humble, and sing a psalm underneath the celebrities, yet destined to put on the crown of Israel. His story is certainly one of humanity, victories, failures, sins, and redemption. And through all of it, a heart that longed for God. Under David, Jerusalem becomes more than a city. It becomes the beating heart of a people. Songs echo through its hills, prayers rise from its gates. For the first time, Israel feels whole. And then Solomon, David's son, ascends the throne. If David's reign was about passion, Solomon's is about wisdom. He builds the great temple, a house not just of stone and cedar, but of identity. Pilgrims come from afar, marveling at its golden walls, and Israel, once a wandering people, now stands as a kingdom, proud and strong. But strength can be fragile. Solomon's expertise is vast, yet his wealth and politics sow seeds of department. While he dies, the kingdom fractures, Israel within the north, Judah within the south, brothers divided. And once more the shadow of exile creeps nearby. Can you feel the pattern forming? Liberation, unity, glory, and then division. It is the rhythm of history, the struggle of every nation. And for the Jewish people, it becomes a cycle that defines centuries. Faith tested, identity refined, destiny shaped not in comfort but in survival. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine you are there. The desert has faded behind you, and the hills of Canaan stretch wide. The grass is greener than anything your people saw in Egypt. The rivers shimmer like silver veins cutting through the land, and the dream of your ancestors is under your feet. And yet peace feels fragile. The tribes scatter across the hills, Reuben, Judah, Benjamin, and the rest. Each builds farms, vineyards, and homes. Children laugh again. Elders sit by the fires telling the younger ones, "We were once slaves, but now we are free." But freedom is restless. Without order, quarrels rise, borders blur, and enemies always watch. The Philistines come with iron swords and towering warriors. The Canaanites guard their fortified cities. Your people, newly planted, feel small again. They cry, "We need a leader. We need a king," and thus begins a new chapter in destiny. Saul, the first king. You see Saul for the first time, tall, broad-shouldered, standing among the tribes like a figure carved from stone. The people cheer, "Here is our king." At first, hope feels real. Victories are won, enemies scattered. Israel, for a moment, stands proud, but leadership is heavy. Saul's heart trembles with doubt. Jealousy creeps in like a shadow in his soul. He fears losing his crown, fears the rise of others. And when David the shepherd boy slays the giant Goliath with nothing but a sling and faith, Saul's fear becomes poison. Imagine standing in that valley, the Philistines jeering, the Israelites trembling, and then a boy steps forward. No armor, no sword, only a stone. He flings it, and the giant falls with a crash that shakes the earth. Silence hangs for a heartbeat. Then erupts into a roar of triumph. It is more than victory, it is a sign, a reminder that courage is not in size or strength, but in faith. David rises, loved by the people, sung by the women, praised by the elders. And Saul, the king, cannot bear it. His downfall begins. David, the shepherd king. And so, destiny turns. David, once a fugitive hunted by Saul, becomes the chosen king. His reign is unlike any before. He unites the tribes, captures Jerusalem, and makes it the beating heart of Israel. Close your eyes again. Picture the city of Jerusalem under David, not grand yet, not golden, but alive. Merchants shout in the markets. Priests sing psalms at dawn. The sound of hammers builds walls, and children run through the narrow streets, their laughter echoing like a promise. David himself is not without flaws. He loves deeply, sins deeply, and repents deeply. Also, his affair with Bathsheba scars his reign, yet his psalms, still rise to heaven like incense, songs of longing, guilt, and hope. He is not always only a king. He is completely human, and that is why the people love him. Through David, Israel learns something vital, that even wrong men can carry divine reason, and that identity is not always about perfection, however endurance. Now you heard listen about Solomon, the temple of glory, and then Solomon, David's son, takes the throne. If David was a flame of passion, Solomon is a calm river of wisdom. Imagine the temple he builds, the first temple. Stones so massive they touch the sky. Walls plated with gold, shining like the sun itself. Cedar beams from Lebanon filling the air with their candy fragrance. Priests in white robes making a song, their voices rolling like thunder across the courtyard. It is more than a building. It is a symbol. For the first time, Israel is not just a wandering people or scattered tribes. They are a kingdom with a coronary heart, with a home, with a God who dwells amongst them. Pilgrims tour from distant lands simply to see it. The Queen of Sheba herself comes marveling at Solomon's knowledge and Israel's prosperity. But prosperity is dangerous. Wealth piles high, alliances multiply, foreign wives bring foreign gods. Solomon's wisdom begins to fray, and when he dies, the unity of Israel dies with him. Division. Brothers at war, the kingdom splits like a cracked vessel, north and south. Israel and Judah, brothers now turned rivals. Jerusalem remains holy, but the bond of family breaks. Wars erupt not just with outsiders, but between kin. Imagine standing on a hill, watching soldiers march against their own brothers. The songs of unity now replaced with cries of betrayal. The temple still stands, but inside the spirit feels wounded. And beyond the borders, great empires stir: Assyria, Babylon. Like storm clouds on the horizon, their shadows stretch toward this fractured land. Israel, once strong under kings, now trembles on the edge of exile. Imagine Jerusalem at dawn. The sun rises a golden over the city, glinting off the walls of Solomon's temple. Traders open their stalls, children run through the slim streets, priests light incense within the sanctuary. For a moment, the entirety feels everlasting, and then the ground trembles. The sound of drums, foreign drums, echoes in the distance. An army approaches, not of neighbors or rivals, but of an empire, first Assyria, then Babylon. The world's giants. The fall of Israel, the northern kingdom, Israel, falls first. Assyrian armies sweep through like a storm. Cities burn, people scatter. Entire tribes vanish, the 10 lost tribes. Their names, as soon as sung inside the desert, now whispered best in memory. Judah, the southern country, watches in dread, clinging to Jerusalem as if its partitions should prevent future. Prophets walk the streets, their voices uncooked with caution. Turn back to God. Do not trust in chariots or kings. But the people grow deaf, their hearts heavy with pride. The fall of Judah and Jerusalem, then comes Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar's armies surround Jerusalem like an iron ring. Months drag into years. Starvation gnaws at the people. The holy city, once alive with music and trade, grows silent but for the wails of hunger. Finally, the walls crack. Soldiers flood in. The temple, Solomon's golden masterpiece, is torn apart. Flames leap into the sky, and the Ark of the Covenant vanishes into mystery. Priests cry as sacred vessels are carried away. Families are shackled, marched into chains, dragged across deserts to Babylon. Stop and picture it. You are one of them. A child holding your mother's hand, forced to leave your home, watching Jerusalem fade behind you in smoke. The place you thought was eternal, gone. This moment becomes the wound at the center of Jewish memory, a wound that never fully heals. The life in Babylon, songs by the rivers, but exile is not the end. In Babylon, something remarkable happens. By the rivers, the people weep. The Psalms record their cries. How can we sing the Lord's song in a foreign land? And yet they do sing, not in the temple, but in homes. Not on golden altars, but on scrolls and stories. Here, the Torah becomes their anchor. Faith turns portable. Identity no longer depends on walls or kings, but on memory, on teaching, on tradition passed from parent to child. Babylon becomes both prison and birthplace. The synagogue is born. Scripture deepens. The dream of return sharpens into prophecy. One day we will go back. One day Zion will rise again. Now it is time to the return under Persia, then. History shifts. Persia rises, Babylon falls. And Cyrus the Great, unlike other conquerors, does something extraordinary. He allows the exiles to return. Not all go, but enough. Imagine stepping back into Jerusalem after decades. The city is rubble, the temple gone, the streets silent, and yet hope is stronger than despair. Stones are lifted again, altars rebuilt. A second temple rises, smaller, humbler, but burning with faith. Ezra and Nehemiah, leaders of this return, and remind the people that identity is not in walls alone, but in covenant. In keeping alive the story, the rituals, the songs. Exile as a lesson is about loss, but also survival. The people lost their land, their king, their temple, yet they did not lose themselves. In Babylon, in exile, they discovered something that would carry them through every future tragedy. That Jewishness was not only about a place, but about a promise. It was in exile that they learned to live as a people of memory, able to carry their identity across any border, across any time. Close your eyes and picture it again. You are standing at the banks of the Euphrates in Babylon, and the water moves slowly, carrying whispers of lands far away. Around you, Jewish exiles gather, tired, thin, their clothes worn, but their eyes filled with songs they cannot sing. One man begins softly. By means of the rivers of Babylon, we sat and wept while we remembered Zion. The melody spreads. Soon a quiet chorus rises, not joyous, not loud, but trembling with longing. The Babylonians, curious, mock them. Sing us one of the songs of your temple. Entertain us. But the people bow their heads. How can we sing the Lord's song in a foreign land? This is not just sorrow, it is a declaration. Their songs are sacred, tied to the soil of Jerusalem, to the stones of the temple. And yet, in refusing to sing for mockery, they preserve something holy. The prophets in exile. On this darkness, the voices of prophets thundered Jeremiah. The weeping prophet had already warned them, "This town will fall if you do not turn back." They had not listened. And now, his words echo bitterly in their hearts. Ezekiel, taken to Babylon, sees visions that ignite hope. In his dreams, dry bones rise and form living armies. He tells the exiles, "You will live again. Your nation will not die forever." Imagine hearing that when your world has just collapsed. For a people stripped of home, his words were lifelines, and then Daniel, young, taken into the Babylonian court. He refuses to eat the king's food, prays to God even if forbidden, and survives the lion's den. His courage becomes legend some of the exiles, proof that faith can defy empires. Daily life in Babylon, but beyond prophecy and miracles, existence in exile is painfully human. Families wake in cramped homes, fathers look for work under Babylonian masters, moms whisper Hebrew lullabies so their children do not forget their tongue. Markets are filled with strange fruits and spices, temples dedicated to gods they do not know. Yet in secret, in quiet corners, the Torah is taught, stories are retold. The Sabbath is kept alive. This is how identity survives, not in palaces, but in kitchens, in songs, in the way a parent tells their child, "We were once free, and we will be free again." Hope returns decades pass. Babylon, the mighty empire, begins to crack. Persia rises, led by Cyrus the Great, and then the unthinkable happens. Cyrus issues a decree. You may go home. Can you imagine it? After 70 years of exile, families gather, whispering in disbelief. Elders kiss the ground. Children who were born in Babylon pack for a land they have only heard of in stories. The journey back is not easy. When they arrive, Jerusalem is rubble, the temple is ash, the walls are broken. And yet, in those ruins, hope blooms. Ezra, the scribe, unrolls the Torah before the humans and reads aloud. For hours they stand, listening, weeping, promising to live through those words again. Nehemiah, the governor, rallies them to rebuild the partitions. Stone through stone, gate through gate, Jerusalem breathes again. The second temple is not as grand as Solomon's, but when it is complete, the people sing once more. The sound rises into the heavens, not a song of pride, but of resilience. For they now know a temple may fall, a city may burn, but their faith can live anywhere. This is the greatest lesson of exile, that identity is not bound to stone, but to spirit, that memory is stronger than fire. That the covenant survives not because of kings, but because of people who refuse to forget. Exile as eternal memory even after return, the memory of Babylon never leaves. It becomes a shadow in every prayer, a caution in every celebration. At weddings, a glass is broken, a reminder of the temple's destruction. At Passover, they whisper, "Next year in Jerusalem." The exile is no longer just history, it is a rhythm of identity. Every future generation will carry it as both wound and hope. You need to know about the Second Temple era, empires, faith, and survival. You imagine yourself taking walks through the slim streets of Jerusalem. The air smells of stone, dust, and fresh-cut cedar, and the hammers echo as guys work tirelessly, rebuilding gates and houses, setting stones one after another. Children chase every different around the ruins, their laughter mixing with the clink of chisels. The city, though scarred, is alive again. At the heart of it stands something new, the Second Temple. It does not shine with the gold of Solomon's masterpiece, but it glows with something stronger, faith renewed. When the people gather here, they do not just see walls and pillars. They see survival, they see proof that exile could not break them. Under Persian rule for a while, life feels gentler. Under Persian kings, the Jews are allowed to worship freely. Priests lead prayers, scribes keep the Torah, and the rhythm of festivals fills the calendar again. Passover, Yom Kippur, Sukkot, each holiday will become no longer just tradition, but a declaration. We are nevertheless right here. But empires never stand still. One day, whispers spread. A conqueror is coming. His name is Alexander of Macedon. The world will never the same. The Greeks arrive. Picture Jerusalem when Alexander enters. His soldiers' bronze armor glitters under the sun. Their footsteps thunder in unison. The people watch, anxious, clutching their children, wondering if their temple will burn again. But Alexander is not like Babylon's kings. History tells that he honors the high priest, even bows before the God of Israel. For a time, peace reigns. Greek culture, philosophy, art, language washes into Jewish life. Some embrace it, learning Greek words, adopting new styles. Others resist, whispering that identity must remain pure, and slowly, tension grows. The Seleucid oppression after Alexander's death, his empire splits, and Jerusalem falls under the Seleucid kings. At first, coexistence is possible. But soon a new ruler rises. Antiochus IV. He does not tolerate difference. He marched into the temple, desecrates it, and forbids Jewish practices. Imagine the pain of that moment. Sabbath outlawed. Circumcision banned, Torah scrolls burned in public squares. Priests dragged into the streets. It feels like exile again, but this time in their own land. The Maccabean revolt in darkness, sparks ignite. And a small village, an old priest named Mattathias refuses to bow to a Greek idol. He strikes down the king's officer and cries out, "Whoever is zealous for the law, follow me." His sons take up arms. Among them is Judah Maccabee, the hammer. The rise starts normal farmers and shepherds, combat-skilled infantry soldiers, battles rage in hills and valleys. In opposition to all odds, the Maccabees win, and that they retake Jerusalem. Once they input the desecrated temple, they light the menorah with the last drop of oil. This becomes the tale of Hanukkah, the festival of lighting, a celebration of resilience and religion. Even today, Jewish families light candles in reminiscence of that moment, whispering that miracles are possible when people refuse to surrender Roman shadows, but history's wheel keeps turning. Rome, the Iron Empire, begins its march eastward. Their banners, their legions, their roads, they reshape the world. By the time they enter Jerusalem, Jewish independence is already fragile. The Maccabees' descendants rule as kings and priests, but corruption weakens them. Rome does not destroy the temple, not yet. Instead, they place Herod the Great on the throne. He is both king and servant, loyal to Rome but ambitious for his people. He rebuilds the temple with grandeur, overlaying it in marble and gold so dazzling that vacationers say it blinds in the daylight. And yet, under the beauty, unrest simmers. Heavy taxes, Roman soldiers patrolling the streets, whispers of rebel in every market. Religion in the shadows of empire. Through all of this, ordinary people cling to faith. In the temple courts, prayers rise like incense. In small villages, rabbis gather children under olive trees to teach them the law. In family houses, the Sabbath desk glows with candles, bread, and wine, a small sanctuary towards the empire's might. The humans live with an anxiety that will define them for centuries, the way to stay themselves even as empires rise and fall round them. Seeds of a new destiny in this age, voices rise that will shape not simply Jewish history, however the history of the entire world. Prophets speak of a Messiah, a Savior who will bring justice, who will ruin the yoke of oppressors. Some expect a warrior king like David, others a spiritual teacher, still others a mysterious figure of divine light. This expectation burns like a hidden flame. And soon, under Roman rule, that flame will set the stage for revolts, for messianic movements, and for the rise of faiths that will transform civilizations. Close your eyes for a moment and picture Jerusalem again. The sun is just rising, spilling orange and pink light over the city's hills. The temple gleams, not just in stone and marble, but in the devotion of those who climb its steps. You hear sandals scuff against the limestone, see mothers pulling children by the hand. fathers carrying doves for sacrifice, and priests in white robes lifting their voices in prayer. It feels peaceful, but just beneath that surface, the heartbeat of the city is uneasy, because everyone knows empires do not stay still. Everyday life under empires, what was it like to be an ordinary person then? You wake in a small clay house on the outskirts of Jerusalem. Your roof is flat, built of mud and straw, where your family sometimes sleeps under the stars in summer. The air smells of bread baking, goats bleating, the faint tang of olive oil pressed nearby. You head to the market. It is alive with voices in many tongues. Greek merchants call out prices for wine and pottery. Roman soldiers pass, their armor clinking, faces stern. Jewish farmers bargain over barley and figs. But you notice something odd? Neighbors are divided. Some speak Greek freely, wearing tunics in the latest style, quoting philosophers as if they were prophets. Others keep their fringed cloaks tightly wrapped, muttering in Hebrew, warning that assimilation is a slow death. You stand between them, torn. Who are we meant to be? Children of Torah? Citizens of empire? Or somehow both? The silent struggles of identity in homes. Parents whisper to their children at night, "Never forget who you are." The world outside may be loud, but here at this table, you are Israel. And yet, outside those doors, children learn Greek songs, soldiers enforce Roman law, and life feels like a constant negotiation. One day, a boy's name is Judah. The next, his friends call him Eudas. Languages blur, identities shift, and the people wonder, how much can we bend before we break? Hanukkah remembered every year. Even years after the Maccabean revolt, the memory of that miracle stays alive. And imagine sitting in a home during winter. The family gathers around a small bronze lamp. A child asks, "Why do we light these flames, Father?" And the father replies softly, "Because when all seemed lost, when our temple was defiled and our God insulted, hope burned brighter than oil. This light is us, my child, fragile but eternal." Each candle becomes not just flame, but defiance. Each flame whispers across centuries, "You cannot extinguish us." Under Rome's shadow, but the Roman shadow grows longer every year. You can almost hear legionnaires' sandals on the stone roads, the rattle of their standards in the wind. They are everywhere, patrolling, taxing, watching. The taxes bite deep. A farmer sighs as he counts coins that should have bought food, now taken by Rome. A merchant weeps as soldiers seize his goods. Families feel the weight of empire in their stomachs, in their tired backs, in their fading laughter. And yet, every Sabbath, everything stops. Candles glow. Bread is broken, wine is shared. For one day each week, the empire loses its power because time itself belongs to God. That pause, that sacred rhythm becomes the strongest rebellion of all. In the marketplaces, new voices rise, fiery preachers, teachers, dreamers. They speak of justice, of deliverance, of a coming Savior who will restore Israel's dignity. Some say he will be a king like David, wielding the sword against Rome. Others say he will be a teacher, one whose words will cut sharper than blades. People listen with trembling hope. Is this the Messiah? Could freedom be nearby? Each whisper sparks both excitement and fear, for Rome crushes rebellion without mercy. The human heart of survival. Through all of it, the Jewish people survive no longer because of armies, no longer because of kings, but because of ordinary hearts. The mom who hums psalms to her child as squatties march past the window. The father who risks everything to teach his son the letters of Hebrew by candlelight. The young girl who saves one torn Torah scroll from being burned and hides it under her bed. History remembers the kings and generals, but survival? Survival belongs to these quiet acts of devotion. The calm before the storm nears its end. The second temple still stands, brilliant under the sun. Pilgrims still sing as they ascend its steps. Festivals still fill Jerusalem with color and song. But you, walking those streets in your imagination, can feel it. A storm is coming. Rome grows restless with constant uprisings. The people grow tired of bending. Anger simmers. The Second Temple era is not just about survival. It is about the fragile, luminous glow of faith, burning even as empires circle like wolves, and soon that glow will face its darkest night. Destruction and diaspora. The autumn of Jerusalem, the year is 70 CE. The summertime sun burns fiercely over Jerusalem. However, the city itself feels less warm than ever. Hunger haunts each nook. The siege through Rome has dragged on for months. Streets that when rang with psalms and prayers are suffering from silence, dirt, and depression. You walk slowly through the once slender lanes to your thoughts, and the scent of smoke and ash clings to the air. A mother clutches her infant tighter, whispering prayers even though her lips tremble with thirst. A group of young men argue in a broken whisper. Some cry for surrender, others cry for war. Hope and hopelessness wrestle in every heart. The temple under siege, the Second Temple, once the pride and pulse of the Jewish people, stands like a wounded giant. Its marble walls still gleam under the sun, but cracks are everywhere, not just in stone, but in the spirits of those who guard it. Priests carry out rituals even as Roman catapults thunder in the distance. Every sound feels final. Every prayer feels desperate. Will God save us? One child asks his father, pointing toward the temple's towering columns. The father closes his eyes, fighting back tears. He is here, my son. Even now, even if we fall, he is here. And then it happens. The walls shudder and flames roar higher. The Roman soldiers storm the city like an unstoppable tide. They ruin doors, topple walls, and their swords flash under the red sky. The air fills with screams, prayers, and the sharp crackle of burning timber. Temple is about ablaze. And the golden menorah, the great seven-branched lamp that once symbolized light everlasting, melts in the fireplace as fury. Scrolls of Torah, written lovingly by generations, turn to ash that swirls into the heavens. The sacred space, believed to be the meeting point between heaven and earth, collapses in chaos. If you close your eyes, you could almost listen it. The roar of flames, the cries of priests, the deep silence as stone gives way to dust. Tears in the streets outside, the people scatter. Some run, but most collapse to their knees. Men tear their garments. Women lift their hands toward the heavens. Children weep without understanding why their parents cry harder than ever before. For generations, Jerusalem had been the heartbeat of the Jewish identification. And now, as the temple falls, it feels just like the heart itself has been torn out. Exile and dispersion, but history does not end in ashes. The Rome, merciless in victory, scatters the survivors across the empire. Chains rattle as households are marched into slavery, and others flee to distant lands, to Babylon, to North Africa, to Europe. The people are scattered like seeds within the wind, unsure if they will ever take root again. Yet something remarkable happens in this despair. In small gatherings in exile, parents still whisper prayers to their children. They tell the stories of Abraham, of Moses, of David. They recite psalms even in foreign lands. They keep the Sabbath even when mocked for resting while others labor. The temple is gone. Jerusalem lies in ruins. But identity, that fragile yet unbreakable flame, lives on. A people without a home? A boy standing on a Roman street away from home, clutching his mom's hand as she sells cloth to survive. He hears the laughter of strangers, the harsh shouts of soldiers. However, in his heart he remembers the songs of Zion, or imagine a family by the rivers of Babylon, tears falling into the water as they sing softly, "How can we sing the Lord's tune in an overseas land?" It is grief, but it is also defiance. Because to sing at all, even in tears, is to refuse to disappear. The birth of the diaspora, this is where the great diaspora begins, the scattering of the Jewish people to every corner of the earth. They carry no kingdom, no temple, no army, only memory, only faith, only the stubborn belief that one day somehow they will return. This belief, impossible, unbelievable to outsiders, becomes their strength. Wherever they go, from Spain to Persia, from Egypt to Rome, they build little Jerusalem in their hearts. The quiet survival, and so, though the temple burns, though Rome celebrates its triumph, though the people are scattered, a whisper endures, we are still here. Because survival itself has become the greatest act of rebellion. The dust of Jerusalem's ruins still clings to the sandals of those who survive. When the Romans break the city, they do not just crush walls, they try to crush hope. Families are separated, chains clatter on weary wrists, and the long march into exile begins. But if you walk alongside them in your imagination, you will see something remarkable. Even as Roman soldiers shout orders, even as children stumble with exhaustion, some lips still move in prayer. Some voices still hum old psalms, low and trembling but unbroken. Because even in exile, the people carry their homeland in their breath. The long road out of Zion, picture the caravan, men, women, elders, and children driven out of the gates of Jerusalem. The temple lies behind them in flames, but ahead lies the unknown. Some are sent to the great cities of Rome and Alexandria as slaves, others scattered to desert villages. And yet, at nighttime, whilst the soldiers' relaxation and the chains stop rattling, and mother bends near her infant, she whispers, "Remember this, we are children of Abraham. One day, the Lord will gather us again." The child does not fully understand, but he remembers the sound of her voice. And that memory will echo for generations. Rome and the scattered seeds. In Rome, the spoils of Jerusalem are paraded in triumph. The golden menorah of the temple is carried high for all to see, a trophy of conquest. Crowds cheer, but among the crowd somewhere a Jew stands silent. His eyes are filled not with defeat, but with fire. Because he knows gold can be stolen, walls can be destroyed, but a covenant cannot be paraded away. Meanwhile, across the empire, scattered groups begin to rebuild. In dusty corners of Egypt, in the bustling markets of Antioch, in quiet villages along the Tiber, small communities of exiles gather. They pray, they tell stories, they mark the Sabbath. It looks fragile, it looks weak. But it is in these fragile circles that survival is born. The memory of Zion. Every gathering ends with the same vow, whispered with tears. Next year in Jerusalem, it is not just a phrase, it becomes a heartbeat. For 2,000 years, through every trial, that whisper will remain. A people without a land, but never without a dream. Think about that for a moment, how powerful memory is. You can take away stone and soil, but if a people carry their homeland in their songs, in their prayers and their stories, then Zion still breathes. Now imagine a little boy in Alexandria sitting by the docks where ships from every land arrive. He sells figs to sailors, his small hands sticky with juice. He looks like any other poor child. But when night falls, his father gathers him close, lights a tiny lamp, and tells him about the temple, about Jerusalem, about David and Solomon. The boy listens with wide eyes. Though he has never seen Jerusalem, it lives inside him now. A place he's never walked becomes the path of his soul. This is how a people survive exile, by planting Jerusalem in the hearts of their children, and the shadow of Rome is heavy. In some cities, Jews are tolerated as buyers, physicians, or scholars. And in others, they are mocked, marginalized, and occasionally pushed out. Jews' life in exile is a rhythm of struggle and resilience. However, with each hardship, the Jewish identity hardens like iron in a forge. They turn out to be no longer just survivors, but guardians of memory. The Torah becomes no longer just scripture, but a portable homeland. Wherever the scrolls are read, Zion is alive. The first diaspora legacy. As the first century ends, the Jewish world is scattered everywhere. The land of their ancestors is broken. Their holy place turned to rubble, but the people remain. And the paradox is this. In losing their land, they discover the strength of their identity. A Jew in Babylon, a Jew in Rome, a Jew in Egypt. They may never see each other, but they are connected by story, by prayer, by hope. A whisper that defies time. Can you hear it? Across centuries, across continents, across every hardship, the whisper that defies history. We are still here. We are still the children of Zion. And though Rome thought it ended the story in 70 CE, it was only the beginning of another chapter, the chapter of the diaspora. Life in exile, the rise of the diaspora communities. The fire of the temple is long gone, but the smoke of memory lingers. Jerusalem lies in ruins. The people are scattered. The Romans thought they ended a nation, yet in truth they planted its seeds across the world. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine yourself waking not in Zion, but in a foreign land. The air smells different. The language around you feels harsh, unfamiliar. And yet, as the sun sets, your family gathers. A small lamp is lit, a prayer is whispered. Suddenly, despite distance, despite exile, Jerusalem is there, alive in your breath. This is how a people begin life in exile. A world without a center. When the temple fell, it was not just a building destroyed. It was the heartbeat of an entire people. The sacrifices, the festivals, the sense of God's house standing at the center of the world, all of it reduced to ashes. But here lies the miracle. Instead of vanishing, the Jewish heart found a new center, not in stone, but in scripture. Not in walls, but in words. The Torah became the homeland. Wherever a scroll was unrolled, wherever children were taught the Shema, the people found Jerusalem again. Communities in the shadows of empires, the Roman Empire, his small agencies of exiles began to settle. In the Rome, they lived near the Tiber, and cramped quarters in which the odor of the river blended with the smoke of cooking fires. In Alexandria, Egypt, Jewish philosophers debated alongside Greeks, mixing faith with philosophy. In Babylon, far from Rome's reach, Jews studied, argued, and wrote, and in time, they would create the Babylonian Talmud, a book that would guide Jewish life for centuries. They were no longer one nation in one land, but many small lights scattered across a darkened world. Life in ghettos and quarters. Walk with me for a moment into a medieval street. The stones are narrow, the houses close. This is the Jewish quarter, a place both safe and confined. Here, families bake bread, mend clothes, and sing old songs. The children chase each other in the dust and laughing, their curls bouncing. But beyond the quarter's gates lies suspicion, sometimes hatred. Jews are tolerated as moneylenders, traders, or healers, but rarely as equals. They are marked as different and carry the burden of exile on their backs. And within those narrow streets, a culture blooms. Stories are told, songs are sung. Every Sabbath, candles are lit, and in that glow the people remember, we are still Israel, carriers of memory. What is memory if not survival? Imagine a grandmother in Spain whispering prayers in Hebrew by candlelight, and a father in Persia instructing his son the 10 Commandments. Again, imagine a young girl in Morocco tracing the letters of the alphabet in the dust with her finger. Each of these small acts seems ordinary, but together they build a fortress stronger than Rome's legions. A fortress of memory. The golden ages in shadows, it was not all darkness. In Muslim Spain, under enlightened rulers, Jews thrived, and they became poets, doctors, philosophers. Also, men like Maimonides rose, writing works that are studied even today. For a moment, it felt as if exile had turned into a flowering. Jews spoke Arabic, debated with Muslims and Christians, and created a bridge of ideas between worlds. But even golden ages are fragile. With each political shift, the light dimmed, and once again exile's shadow returned, expulsions, forced conversions, wandering anew. The Torah as a homeland through it all, the Torah remained the constant. No matter the land, no matter the empire, a Jew could hold the scroll, kiss it, and feel home. Isn't that extraordinary? A people with no land, no king, no temple, and yet they remain whole because of words written on parchment. It is as if God whispered, "You may lose stone and soil, but you will never lose me." A people of hope exile was never just survival. It was hope in disguise. In every prayer, one line pulsed through generations. Next year in Jerusalem. Whispered in Babylon, whispered in Spain, whispered in Poland, whispered in Morocco. It was never about geography, it was about identity. It became a reminder that no matter where you are a part of story that commenced with Abraham and Sarah, continued with Moses, and cannot be erased by any empire. The soul of exile, so if you were to sit by the fire with an exile family, you would see no grandeur, no palaces. You would see bread, olives, a little wine if they were lucky. You would hear laughter, you would hear sorrow. You would hear stories surpassed from parent to baby, stories that anchored their souls while the world around them shifted like sand. And in their eyes you would see something unbreakable, a quiet defiance. A belief that someday, in some way, the journey might turn back toward home. This is the miracle of a people damaged, scattered, and yet unshaken. They grew to become exile into survival, survival into reminiscence, and reminiscence into identification. The story of exile does not move quickly. It unfolds slowly like a candle burning through lengthy, uncertain nights. Each flame is fragile, and yet each one pushes back against the darkness. If you close your eyes now, you can pay attention to the echoes of centuries. Children reciting Hebrew in whisper because their neighbors might not approve. Mothers baking bread and singing lullabies older than the streets they live on. Fathers working as moneylenders or scholars because other professions were denied to them. And through all of it, one unshakable rhythm: we are still here. Scattered yet connected by the Middle Ages, Jewish communities had sprung up everywhere, from North Africa to Persia, from the heart of Spain to the snowy villages of Poland. They were separated through mountains and seas, but all carried the equal prayers. Believe this for a moment. It is Friday night in Cairo, and candles flicker on the desk. Far away in France, another family lights their candles, thousands of miles aside, but each whisper the equal blessing. This invisible thread held them together, even if kings and emperors tried to break them aside. Shadows of persecution. But exile was not gentle. There were pogroms, massacres, forced conversions, towns burned, lives shattered. Whole communities were uprooted overnight. If you concentrate closely, you can almost hear the footsteps, families packing whatever they can carry, children clutching at their mothers' skirts, fathers taking walks ahead with eyes filled with each fear and resolve. And yet, in the very next city, in the very next land, the same families would rebuild. A new quarter would rise. A synagogue would be built, often hidden away but filled with life. Songs would return, hope would take root again. The Jewish people understood something powerful. Knowledge is a weapon no empire can confiscate. So they studied, they taught, they argued over scripture late into the night. In Babylon, scholars gathered and started out compiling debates and wisdom that would become the Talmud, a large sea of thought that carried Jewish law and philosophy forward for centuries. In Spain, poets like Yehuda Halevi wrote verses so beautiful they still echo in synagogues today. In Egypt, Maimonides wrote the guide for the perplexed. Blending philosophy and religion, each prayer whispered, all have been acts of survival. Everyday life in the quarter, step with me into a narrow Jewish street in medieval Europe. The stones are uneven below your feet. A woman draws water from a well. A group of boys chase each other, laughing, even though their parents warn them not to leave the safety of the area. Inside a home, a desk is ready for the Sabbath. Bread covered with a cloth, wine poured. Candles lit, the father raises his hands and blesses his children. For a moment, the world outside, with its suspicion, its rules, and dangers, does not exist. The quarter becomes Jerusalem. The Golden Age and its fragility in Muslim Spain, there was a time whilst Jewish culture shined brightly. They wrote poetry in Arabic and Hebrew, debated with Muslim philosophers, and served as medical doctors, advisors, and scientists in royal courts. It was called a Golden Age. But exile has a way of reminding you that safety can be fleeting. Kingdoms change. New rulers arrive, tolerance fades into fear. And once again, doors slam shut. Synagogues are burned. Families are expelled. It was as if exile was teaching the people a lesson. Bloom where you can, but never forget you are not yet home. Hope carried in words. Every exiled child grew up with a phrase carved into their heart. Next year in Jerusalem. It was said at weddings, at funerals, at the end of every Passover meal. Some children asked their parents, when will next year come? And the parents could only smile sadly and say, someday. However, that word, someday, changed into enough. Sufficient to keep the dream alive, sufficient to keep the people together, enough to outlast empires that rose and fell around them. Consider memory as a river. Think of memory as a river. Empires tried to dam it, but somehow it always flowed. A lullaby sung in one century echoed in another. A story whispered in one land resurfaced in another. Even in exile, memory made them whole. The past was not lost. It was carried, carefully, lovingly, into every new generation. The soul that could not be broken exile tried to strip away identity, but instead it made it stronger. The people became merchants, bankers, philosophers, poets, tailors, farmers, whatever exile demanded. But at their core they remained bound by faith, story, and song. Every time a Sabbath candle was lit, it was not just a ritual, it was defiance. It was saying to the world, we are still here. You cannot erase us. And so it is not just about loss, it is about survival, about how a people turned exile into resilience, ghettos into sanctuaries, and memory into eternity. The Jewish story in exile is not just about being scattered. It is about being scattered and yet unbroken. The Holocaust. Darkness beyond measure. Imagine the world has already turned cold. You are standing in Europe during the 1930s. Streets are bustling and children are playing, stores are open, but beneath it all, a quiet shadow grows. You do not see it, but it is there. Hatred, slow and patient, spreading through words, posters, speeches, and lies. The Jewish people had already faced centuries of exile, but what was coming now was unlike anything the world had ever known. The rise of hatred. Germany, broken after World War I, was looking for someone to blame. In walked Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party, promising to restore pride. But pride built on hate is poison. And Jews, who had lived in Europe for centuries, who spoke the same languages, worked the same trades, wrote poetry, played music, healed the sick, were painted as outsiders. The other. It started small laws. Jews could not hold certain jobs, could not own businesses. Then, they could not attend certain schools. Signs appeared in parks and stores. No Jews allowed. The walls closed in slowly, until one day you woke up and realized your life had been stripped away. The deportations begin. Imagine a knock on the door at midnight. Soldiers telling you to pack quickly. Mothers grabbing children, fathers holding trembling hands. Families herded into trucks, then trains. The trains were not carriages for people. They were cattle cars, dark, airless, crammed. People pressed shoulder to shoulder, no water, no light. Hours turned into days, and when the doors opened again, it was not home. It was Auschwitz, Treblinka, Dachau. Names that even today sound like a wound that never healed. Life in the camps were not places for living. They were places designed for dying. The smell of smoke filled the air, although no wood was burning. Families were torn apart the moment they arrived. Men on one side, women and children on another. Some never saw each other again. Every day was hunger. Every day was fear. Every day was humiliation so deep it tried to crush the human soul. And yet, in the middle of this darkness, there were sparks of humanity. Sparks of humanity in darkness. A prisoner would share a crust of bread even though he was starving. And a mother would whisper lullabies to her child, shielding them from the horror outside. Also, a rabbi would recite prayers quietly, not to defy death, but to remind others that they were still alive, still human. In those moments, survival was not about the body. It was about the soul. The world watches. Too slowly news of the camps trickled out, but too many ignored it. The world was engulfed in war. The Jews cried out, but help was slow, hesitant, late. By the time Allied forces finally entered the camps in 1945, what they found was beyond comprehension. Skeletal survivors with eyes too old for their years. Piles of shoes, glasses, hair, silent witnesses to millions who never walked out. 6 million Jews, 6 million lives, children, poets, rabbis, tailors, mothers, fathers, erased in one of history's darkest acts. A loss that cannot be counted. But the Holocaust was not just numbers, it was faced. The girl who never finished her song, and the boy who dreamed of being a doctor. Also the grandmother who baked challah on Fridays. And the father who used to tell bedtime stories. They were not statistics, they were worlds. Each one carried an entire universe of love, laughter, and light. Memory as resistance. The Nazis wanted them forgotten. But the survivors carried their stories. They spoke, they wrote, they built memorials. Even silence, the heavy silence of those who could not find the words, was a kind of resistance. Every never again whispered after the war was not just a slogan, it was a plea, a demand, a promise. Out of ashes, a future, and yet, from this darkest night, dawn would come. The survivors, damaged yet unbowed, carried their traditions, their language, their religion into new lands. Some went to America, some to Europe, and many dreamed of a hometown in which they would never again be powerless. That dream would shape the following of Jewish records, the introduction of the State of Israel, The darkness beyond measure. Because the Holocaust was not just an event, it was an abyss, and yet the people somehow found the strength to climb back from it. The Holocaust. Darkness beyond measure as you hear footsteps on a cobblestone street. They sound normal at first, boots against stone, a rhythm you have heard before, but tonight they echo differently. There's fear in the air. Curtains twitch in windows. Also, the mom hushes their children. And the knock the door comes sharp, like a blade against silence. Families hold their breath, soldiers bark orders. A father clutches his prayer book, a mother her child's hand. And in that moment, the life they knew, the bakery they owned, the laughter of neighbors, the warmth of the Sabbath candle, all of it vanishes into the night. The train that never ends? Imagine standing inside a wooden cattle car. It smells of sweat, fear, and wood that has absorbed too many tears. And the doors slam shut, or darkness. At first there is confusion. People whisper, "Where are they taking us?" Hours pass, then days. The air grows thin, and babies are cried until their voices break. Also, a grandmother tries to sing, her voice trembling like a candle about to go out. And someone carves a Star of David into the wood with a fingernail, also a mark of identity and mark of defiance. When the doors finally open, there is no relief. Only shouting, dogs barking, guns pointing. Names are not asked. Only numbers are given. A life measured in ashes within the camp, you study fast. Survival is measured not in years, not in months, however in minutes. A piece of bread means one more day. A sip of water means one more hour. The guards call out names not to honor them, but to erase them. Work is endless, carrying stones, digging trenches, moving rocks that have no purpose except to break you. Smoke curls from chimneys, thick and constant. You ask what it is? Someone looks away. Someone else whispers, "It is our families." And then silence. The kind of silence that cannot be described, only carried. The children of silence, the smallest victims, were the ones with the largest eyes. Youngsters who were chasing balls or scribbling letters now learned to stay quiet, to hide, to shrink themselves into corners of barracks. One boy found a piece of chalk and drew a solar at the wall. A girl tied a rag into the shape of a doll, rocking it as if it could protect her. In a world built to destroy innocence, their imagination became the last playground. Light in the shadows, yet even here, there were miracles. And man gave his last piece of bread to a stranger. Also, a rabbi whispered prayers inside the dark, his phrases weaving a delicate thread of hope. A woman hummed lullabies as bombs fell in the distance, and promising their children that there was still beauty in the global. Even inside the darkest night, the human spirit refused to be really extinguished. The world awakens too late, and outside new pieces of the truth. Whispers reached London, Washington, Moscow, but many did not believe. How could anyone believe such evil was possible? By the time the Allies entered the camps in 1945, the war was ending, but for the Jews, the nightmare had already burned through millions of lives. Soldiers walked through the gates of Auschwitz and froze. They saw skeletal figures barely alive, their eyes older than time. And they saw piles of shoes, tiny shoes that had belonged to children who never grew up. Also, they saw mountains of glasses, rings, and hair, silent testimonies that screamed louder than words. The liberators wept. Hardened men of war, who had seen death in battlefields, wept like children, because nothing could prepare them for this. Remembering the faces, 6 million Jews perished. But the Holocaust is not about numbers. It is about the girl who dreamed of playing the violin but never got the chance, and the boy who wanted to become a doctor. Also, the mother who braided her daughter's hair one last time, and the grandfather who whispered blessings even as he walked into the unknown. Each one was a story. Each one was a universe. Memory as resistance survivors carried those stories into the future. Some spoke, some wrote, some built museums and memorials. Others could never carry themselves to talk, but their silence was additionally resistance, because by surviving, they defied those who tried to erase them. Each testimony, each name carved into stone, each candle lit on Holocaust Remembrance Day is a manner of saying, "You did no longer succeed. We are still here." Out of ashes, hope, and yet the greatest miracle of all that after such darkness life continued. Survivors built families, authored books, composed music, created art, and rebuilt communities. For many, one dream became louder than all others: a homeland. A place where Jews could live without fear, where children could laugh without whispers of danger. That dream, smoldering through centuries, was about to ignite into reality. If you are with me right now, close your eyes. Imagine standing in that camp, in that train, in that street. Imagine holding a child's hand. Feel the weight of it. And now, imagine them free. Imagine them safe. Imagine them building again. That is the story we carry forward. Do you know the birth year of Israel? The birth of Israel was in 1948, when the State of Israel was officially established out of the ashes, a dream the battle had ended. Europe was scarred and its cities broken, also the people mourning. Among the survivors of the Holocaust, there was one dream that refused to die: a homeland. For centuries, Jews had whispered of Zion in prayers, in lullabies, in poetry, and scratched onto scraps of paper in ghettos. And after centuries of exile and persecution, that dream was ready to take form. Ships started out to move the Mediterranean, carrying survivors with little more than hope of their pockets. They were thin, tired, many with numbers tattooed on their arms. However, their eyes were burning with determination. They looked at the coastline of Palestine, and many whispered the same words: "We're home." A land of tensions, but the land they dreamed of was not empty. Palestinians, Muslim, and Christian families had lived there for generations. Their olive trees, their markets, their mosques, and churches had deep roots in the soil. So when waves of Jewish refugees arrived, tensions rose. Peoples both holding ancient claims, both dreaming of a future on the same soil. The British, who had ruled Palestine after Global Battle I, tried to balance the scales, but the pressure was too great. Violence broke out in streets, bombs exploded in cafes, neighbors eyed each other with suspicion. By 1947, the world had to decide what to do with this land that peoples called their own. The United Nations votes on November 29, 1947. The United Nations gathered. They proposed a solution: split the land into states, one Jewish, one Arab. When the vote passed, Jewish communities erupted in party. Dancing filled the streets of Tel Aviv. Strangers hugged. Tears ran freely. Survivors of Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen looked at each other and thought, "We have a future." However, for Palestinians, the same vote felt like betrayal. To them, it meant displacement, department, and the loss of their ancestral homes. Families sat in courtyards, shocked, thinking what the destiny would bring. The pleasure of one human was the grief of another. On May 14, 1948, a declaration of small hall in Tel Aviv, David Ben-Gurion stood earlier than a crowd, and his hair was white voice steady, but his arms trembled as he read, says that, "We hereby declare the establishment of a Jewish state in the land of Israel, to be known as the State of Israel." The room erupted. People wept and shouted, "Em Yisrael Chai." Outside, people danced in the streets, and a flag with the Star of David was raised, fluttering in the wind of history. The celebration lasted only hours, because the ink dried and war was already on the horizon. The very next day, armies from Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq invaded. For the Jewish fighters, many still teenagers, many survivors of the Holocaust, it was a fight for existence. They had barely formed a country and defended it with everything they had. Battles raged in Jerusalem, in the Negev desert, along with the coast, where villages are destroyed. People displaced. Over 700,000 Palestinians fled or expelled from their homes. They call the Nakba and catastrophe. For Israelis, it was a miracle against all odds. They are survived. Their state stood. For Palestinians, it was tragedy and families scattered, with keys to lost homes carried like sacred relics. By the end of 1949, the new state of Israel was recognized by many nations, including the United States and the Soviet Union. Jewish refugees from Europe, from Arab countries, and from across the world poured in. The population grew, cities expanded. Fields were planted, a country was being built from scratch. And beneath the celebrations of grief lingered The Palestinians lived in refugee camps in Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, and Gaza, holding a memory of orchards, homes, and villages they could now not reach. That night, after David Ben-Gurion declared the State of Israel, the air in Tel Aviv became thick with a strange mix of jubilation and dread. Fireworks lit up the sky, songs echoed inside the streets, and weary women and men who had lived through ghettos and awareness camps smiled as though they were given permission to breathe again. But even as music carried into the night, distant thunder rolled. It was not weather, it was artillery. The armies of the Arab world advanced quickly, pouring across borders into the land they believed had been unjustly taken. The sound of boots on soil, the roar of vengeance, the scream of shells, these became the lullabies of Israel's first night of independence. For many young Jewish fighters, the war was personal, and had scars on their arms where Nazi numbers had been tattooed. Also, the others were orphans, carrying photographs of parents who never survived Auschwitz or Treblinka. To them, this was not just about borders, this was about existence. Every battle cry was laced with the memory of loss. Every bullet fired was defiance against extinction. In the homes of Palestine yet, while the streets of Tel Aviv filled with cheers, villages across Palestine filled with silence. Families heard the news of partition, then the declaration of Israel, and knew what it meant: uncertainty, fear, displacement. Mothers pressed keys into their children's hands, keys to houses that would soon be abandoned. Grandfathers gathered olive oil jars and family Bibles. They whispered to their children, "We will return." This is temporary, but for hundreds of thousands, that return never came. The Nakba and the catastrophe was not a single event, but a storm of departures, broken families, and endless waiting. Wait for a second and close your eyes. Just imagine that you are in House of Tel Aviv, where a young couple is dancing and holding each other, whispering about naming their first child after the land that had finally given them refuge. Just a few miles away in Haifa, a Palestinian family is piling onto a truck, carrying blankets and bread, leaving behind the stone house their great-grandfather built. Both believe they are right. Both believe this land is theirs. And both are about to live lives defined by this moment. Despite the war raging inside Israel's borders, people were working. Engineers, farmers, teachers, and poets, they were not just surviving, they were building. Kibbutzim, collective farms, sprouted in fields that had been barren for years. Schools opened. Hebrew, once only the language of prayers and scriptures, have become the language of street signs, schoolrooms, and lullabies. The young state was poor, exhausted, and surrounded by enemies. But there was a fierce determination in its people. Never again would Jews be homeless. The refugee camps across the borders, this is another story unfolded, where Palestinian refugees gathered in camps in Lebanon, Jordan, Gaza, and Syria. The camps were made of tents at first, and then concrete blocks, but they never felt like home, and the air became thick with longing. Also, an old man told stories of orange groves, lemon-scented courtyards, of summer nights in Jaffa. Children who had never seen Palestine memorized the names of villages they had never touched. Keys, deeds, and faded photographs became sacred relics, and entire identities were woven around the memory of a homeland lost. Time comes for recognition and division. By the end of 1949, Israel was recognized by major powers, the United States, the Soviet Union, and soon after, much of the world. The Jewish diaspora poured in and bringing new life, diversity to the young state. But the Arab states and the displaced Palestinians refused to recognize its legitimacy. The conflict was no longer a neighborhood quarrel, it becomes a worldwide crisis, shaping alliances, wars, and politics for many years to come. Consider in case you had walked through Tel Aviv in 1949, you would have heard songs playing in cafes, energetic people songs about rebuilding, planting, dancing. And some other side, if you had walked through a Palestinian refugee camp in Gaza, you would have heard some other type of song, sorrowful laments sung in Arabic of return and yearning of lost orchards and abandoned mosques. It was like something that two peoples side by side, yet worlds apart, each singing to the same land. In the 1950s and 60s, the young kingdom of Israel had slightly drawn breath before the winds of war blew once more. The ink on its Declaration of Independence was hardly dry. But its borders had been already stressed, transferring, bleeding. A nation in its childhood, the 1950s were Israel's infancy. A land filled with tents and temporary housing, also immigrants pouring in from every direction. Where the survivors of the Holocaust arriving hollow-eyed from Europe, and Jews from Yemen to Iraq walking off plains barefoot, carrying little more than faith and memories. Streets echoed with dozens of languages. At one table, Russian lullabies. At the next, Moroccan proverbs. Hebrew revived, relearned, reborn, became the bridge that tied them together. But while the young nation built schools, kibbutzim, and factories, fear lingered. Armies on its borders waited like wolves, and within, Palestinian villages lay emptied, their families scattered to refugee camps in Suez Crisis. 1956, the world's gaze turned to the Suez Canal in Egypt. And President Gamal Abdel Nasser had seized it, but declaring it for Egypt's people, shaking off European colonial powers. Israel, still young but determined, saw an opportunity. Alongside Britain and France, it launched a military strike into Egypt's Sinai Peninsula. Also, an Israeli tank rumbled across sand, fighter jets screamed above, and for a moment, it seemed like Israel had proven its might. But under pressure from the United States and the Soviet Union, two giants of the Cold War, Israel was forced to withdraw, and saw Israel not just as a survivor, but as a bold actor on the stage of global politics. The Palestinians, watching from refugee camps, saw only the strengthening of a state built on their exile. Let us walk with me into a refugee camp in Lebanon in 1960. The air is thick with the smell of dust and kerosene lamps, but the children run barefoot between cinder-block homes. Old women sit on stoops, weaving, telling stories of orange groves in Yafa and fig trees in Haifa, trees their grandchildren have never seen. Keys hang on walls like sacred relics, keys to homes that no longer stand but are remembered in every prayer, every lullaby. Hope and grief live side by side. Some whisper of returning soon. Others know the waiting will be long, endless. By the 1960s, Israel and the Arab world were no longer just neighbors in conflict. They were pieces on a vast chessboard of the Cold War. The United States began to lean toward Israel, while the Soviet Union armed Egypt and Syria. The Middle East became a theater where the world's two great powers flexed their muscles. And every tank that rolled, even every plane that flew, carried not just local ambition but global tension. And then in June 1967, everything changed. The tension had been building for months, and Egyptian forces massed in Sinai. Syria shelled from the Golan Heights. Jordan joined the pact against Israel. The young nation braced for annihilation. But in 6 amazing days, Israel launched a preemptive strike that reshaped the map. Its planes crippled Egyptian airfields, its tanks swept through Sinai, its paratroopers marched into East Jerusalem. While the dust settled, Israel had taken the Sinai Peninsula, Gaza Strip, West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Golan Heights. The victory turned into breathtaking. For Israel, it turned into survival and triumph, proof that even surrounded, it could not only endure but expand. Soldiers wept at the Western Wall, pressing their foreheads against ancient stones. For many Jews worldwide, it was a moment of spiritual homecoming, but for Palestinians, it was disaster upon disaster. The refugee camps swelled again as families were uprooted from the West Bank and Gaza. The Naksa, the setback, became the word etched into their memories. In Jerusalem, Jewish families danced in the streets, and their sons or daughters in uniform, although their hearts swelling with pride. And in Amman, Beirut, and Damascus, the Palestinian families wept as more cousins, more uncles, more daughters were forced into exile. The two nations celebrating and mourning the same week, under the same sun. By the end of the 1960s, the conflict was no longer about land. It was about memory, trauma, survival, and identity. But the Israel had proven itself militarily unstoppable, and it was now governing millions of Palestinians who did not want its rule. Refugee camps had become cities of longing, raising a generation who knew no homeland but still dreamed of one. The wars had not ended the struggle. Also, they had only carved it deeper into the hearts of both peoples. Imagine Tel Aviv in 1955. The cafes are buzzing with new immigrants. and their faces sunburned from working on farms by day, but their hearts still scarred by the memories of Auschwitz, Warsaw, Baghdad, or Santa. Children run in and out of tiny apartments, and mothers stretch food rations. Also, fathers rebuild their lives with trembling but determined hands. In everyday life was ordinary: weddings, school lessons, soccer matches, and yet under it all, there was always a faint hum of fear. What if another war comes tomorrow? Now, across the border with me in Gaza, Palestinian families live in tents handed out by UNRWA. Rain leaks through the canvas. And food comes in rations too, sacks of flour stamped with blue UN letters. The children play with scraps of wood, and their lullabies are stories of lost orchards and the smell of jasmine in homes left behind. Both peoples tried to live, to laugh, to build, but the shadow of war was everywhere. Israel and the Arab world, different dreams, same fear. By the mid-1950s, Israel and Arab neighbors looked at each other like mirrors that reflected fear back and forth. Israel's dream: security, permanence, survival. The Arab state's dream: return of the Palestinian people, reversal of the 1948 defeat. Neither dream felt negotiable. And so the border simmered. Small raids, border clashes, and tit-for-tat skirmishes filled the headlines, and each attack deepened mistrust, each reprisal hardened resolve. The Suez War in 1956 crisis was more than tanks in Sinai. And it was about dignity, pride, post-colonial identity. For Egyptians, the man Nasser was a hero, the man who stood up to the old European empires. For Israelis, he was a looming threat, promising to wipe their state away. When Israeli paratroopers landed in Sinai, a young soldier later recalled, "I carried my father's Holocaust tattoo in my heart as I felt like this was not only a war for land, but for our right to live." Meanwhile, in a refugee camp near Gaza, Fatima, a mother of three, sighed, "Each gunshot reminded me that our lives were waiting in someone else's hands. We had no control." Different voices, same trembling ground. Jewish unity, Palestinian dispersal in the 1950s and 60s also reshaped identities. For Jews, this was a time of ingathering. Airlifts brought Yemenite Jews in Operation Magic Carpet. Iraqi Jews were flown in during Operation Ezra and Nehemiah. Each arrival was seen as a miracle, a prophecy fulfilled. For Palestinians, this was a time of scattering. Families split across Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, and beyond. Some clung to refugee camps, others migrated further, but all carried keys and deeds, proof of homes they swore they would one day return to. Hope for one people, exile for another, both etched permanently in memory. The Six-Day War, when June in 1967 arrived, fear was suffocating. Radios in Israel blared warnings. People dug mass graves in anticipation, preparing for the worst. A Holocaust survivor in Jerusalem said, "We sharpened kitchen knives because we thought they would come for us again." And then 6 days that shocked the world. Israel's preemptive strike shattered the Egyptian Air Force. Jordan lost East Jerusalem. Syria lost the Golan Heights. By the 7th day, the map was transformed. In Israel, jubilation was indescribable. Soldiers wept at the Western Wall, whispering ancient prayers, "Next year in Jerusalem." For many, it felt like history itself had bent toward survival. But for Palestinians, the Six-Day War became the Nakba, the setback. Another 300,000 displaced, swelling the camps with new waves of grief. A teacher in Ramallah said, "Yesterday I instructed my students in their classrooms. Today I look for them in the dust of the camps." The war created more than new borders. It created a new reality. Israel now controlled territories with millions of Palestinians. Suddenly it was no longer only about neighbors, it was about rulers and the ruled. For Israelis, this was security, a buffer zone against future attacks. For Palestinians, it was humiliation and living under checkpoints, military orders, occupation. And in the shadows of despair, whispers of resistance began to grow. The 1960s ended not with peace but with two peoples locked in a cycle of victory and loss, pride and pain. In the 1950s and 60s were not just dates in a textbook, and they were years when weddings were interrupted by gunfire, when lullabies were replaced by news reports, and when maps were redrawn, memories became heavier. Two peoples dreamed under the same sky. The one dreamed of finally belonging. The other dreamed of finally returning. And both, in their own ways, woke each morning with the same prayer, to live in peace, though neither could find it. A world still shaken after '67 and the early 1970s. Imagine yourself in Jerusalem. The streets still echo with songs of triumph after the Six-Day War. Posters of soldiers at the Western Wall hang proudly. Mothers bake bread with a little more joy, and schoolchildren author essays about the miracle of '67. But walk into a Palestinian refugee camp in Lebanon, and you will find another world entirely. The word on everyone's lips is Naksa, the setback. Homes are still lost, families more divided than ever, and a whole generation of children grows up not in villages but in dusty camps, dreaming of resistance. One land, two opposite emotions, triumph and despair, and both are fuel for what is coming. The 1970s birthed the Palestine Liberation Organization, PLO, as more than a name. It became a banner for displaced hearts. In training camps in Jordan and Lebanon, young men and women carried weapons not because they loved violence, but because they had nothing else left to carry. Their songs were of return. Their posters filled with keys and maps of Palestine. For Israelis, this era felt like shadows closing in. Airplane hijackings, cross-border raids, and attacks in cities made daily life uncertain. A bus ride, a trip to the market, a day at school, everything carried the whisper, "What if today is the day something happens?" Then came a moment that shook the entire world. The Munich Olympics in 1972, the athletes from every nation gather in Munich, Germany. It is meant to be a celebration of peace through sports and a healing after the darkness of World War II, but one dawn, shooters from the group Black September storm into the Olympic Village. 11 Israeli athletes are taken hostage, and the world watches in horror as the standoff unfolds live on television. The rescue attempt fails. All 11 athletes are killed. For Israelis, Munich was not just a tragedy, it was a reminder that even in a place meant for peace, they were never safe. For Palestinians, the world finally noticed their cause, though many mourned that it had come at such a human cost. The world's sympathy and anger intertwined, deepening the divide. Meanwhile, leaders moved chess pieces in smoky rooms. The Cold War meant the U.S. stood firmly with Israel, while the Soviet Union armed many Arab states. In Washington, American officials spoke of Israel as a strategic ally. In Cairo, President Anwar Sadat of Egypt planned quietly, with eyes always fixed on the humiliation of 1967. "We will fight. So the world remembers us with dignity again," and he spoke. Behind the speeches, an ordinary people carried the weight, an Israeli farmer digging trenches near his field, an Egyptian soldier drilling under the desert sun, a Palestinian mother clutching ration cards tighter. It is October 6, 1973, the holiest day in the Jewish calendar, Yom Kippur, also the Day of Atonement, and the streets of Israel are silent, radios off, and families fasting, praying. Suddenly, Egyptian forces cross the Suez Canal, storming Israeli positions in Sinai. Syrian troops sweep down the Golan Heights. Israel, caught completely off guard, reels in shock. In the first days, despair grips the nation and families huddle in bomb shelters. Soldiers whisper, "This might be the end." A Holocaust survivor watching her sons march to the front murmurs, "We have lived this fear before." But Israel recovers, mobilizing reserves and aided by U.S. airlifts of weapons, and fierce battles rage in the desert and on the hills. By the end of Israeli tanks reach within miles of Cairo and Damascus. Militarily, Israel holds the advantage. But emotionally, both sides feel broken. For Egyptians, it was not defeat, it was dignity. They had crossed the canal, shattered the myth of Israeli invincibility, and restored Arab pride. For Israelis, it was survival by the narrowest margin, and a reminder that triumph is never permanent. In the 1970s ended with exhaustion. Too much blood, too many funerals, too many borders drawn and redrawn. Yet something new flickered in the distance. Anwar Sadat shocked the world in 1977 when he flew to Jerusalem, the first Arab leader to ever step foot in Israel, and he stood in the Knesset and said, "No more war, no more bloodshed." Some cheered, believing peace was possible, and others called him a traitor. So, The 1970s left behind not just scars, but also a strange, fragile seed, the possibility that after decades of exile, wars, and terrorism, words could do what weapons never could. Imagine that you are a young Israeli boy in Tel Aviv in the early 70s. Also, you carry your school bag with one hand, but in the other you clutch a gas mask because everyone is told to keep one nearby and your mother pretends it's just precaution. But you see her glance at the sky too often. Meanwhile, in a refugee camp outside Beirut, a Palestinian child kicks a worn-out football across a dusty lot, and his father says softly, "One day you will kick this ball on our real street, also in our real home." And he does not fully believe it, but he says it anyway, because hope is the only inheritance he can pass on. These two children, so far apart, yet bound by the same story of fear, longing, and the weight of history. Even as battles and tragedies unfolded, meetings were taking place behind closed doors. And leaders smoked cigars in wood-paneled rooms, also their words shaping the fates of millions they would never meet. In Washington, Henry Kissinger spoke of shuttle diplomacy, flying tirelessly between capitals, trying to prevent one war from bleeding into another. In Cairo, Anwar Sadat reminded his ministers that Egypt needed both victory and peace. Our people are tired. They need bread as much as they need pride. In Jerusalem, Golda Meir, Israel's prime minister, often stayed awake into the night, drinking endless cups of black coffee, asking herself repeatedly, how long can we survive surrounded by enemies? Diplomacy was never just politics. It was a lifeline, fragile and yet essential. Now, I am telling you about some personal stories from the Yom Kippur War. When the Yom Kippur War erupted in October 1973, it was not just tanks and planes that clashed. It was lives, families, faiths, and fears. In the Sinai desert, an Egyptian soldier carried a small notebook, and inside were poems he had written to his fiancée back in Cairo, and his last entry before crossing the Suez Canal: "If I return, I will bring you a ring made of victory, and if I do not, remember me in your prayers." On the Golan Heights, an Israeli reservist scribbled a quick note to his children before battle: "Abba loves you. Be brave for your mother." That crumpled note was found weeks later in his pocket. These stories did not make it into history textbooks, but they live in whispers, passed down in families, a reminder that wars are not numbers. They are broken hearts and unfulfilled dreams. The Yom Kippur War did not just shake the Middle East, it shook the world. When Arab oil producers declared an embargo in response to Western support for Israel, the price of oil quadrupled. In America and Europe, people waited in long lines at gas stations. Car-free Sundays became common. Families worried not just about the Middle East, but about whether they could afford heating in winter. Suddenly, the conflict was no longer far away. It was inside every household across the globe. By the end of the war, thousands were dead. Entire landscapes bore scars of battle. Yet something unexpected happened. Egypt, though militarily pushed back, felt victorious. They had broken the image of Israeli invincibility. Israel, though shaken, had survived against all odds once again. And because of this fragile balance, both sides, for the first time, started to wonder, if we can destroy each other, must we finally learn to live with each other? It was this question that set the stage for Anwar Sadat's bold visit to Jerusalem in 1977. The 1970s were not just years in a history book. They were years when markets fell silent during bomb alerts, when mothers waited by radios for news of their sons, when a child's bedtime prayer was simply, "Please let tomorrow be ordinary." And yet, within all this darkness, small lights appeared: a soldier's poem, a leader's unexpected handshake, a whisper of dignity reclaimed. The story of the Jewish people, of their neighbors, of this land, it is not just one of endless conflict. It is one of endurance, memory, and the fragile courage to hope, even when hope feels impossible. It was a time of late summer in 1978. The mountains of Maryland are calm, covered in deep forests, but inside a secluded retreat called Camp David. The history is trembling. Three figures: the U.S. President Jimmy Carter, Egyptian President Anwar Sadat, and Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin, walk slowly along gravel paths, and guarded not just by soldiers but by the weight of centuries of blood and mistrust. Imagine the air, tense, quiet, yet filled with a fragile hope. Sadat, once a soldier against Israel, now dares to dream of peace. Begin, once a militant fighter, struggles to believe that peace could ever be real. Carter, a farmer's son from Georgia, carries the impossible burden of being the bridge. For 13 days, arguments erupted behind closed doors. Carter scribbled notes. Sadat grew frustrated, retreated into silence. But finally, the Camp David Accords were signed. The world saw something unbelievable. Two men, enemies in war, clasping hands with hesitant smiles. Sadat and Begin, standing together with Carter in between. The cameras capturing the moment that whispered, "Maybe peace is not impossible." For Egyptians, it meant a chance to reclaim dignity and the Sinai Desert. For Israelis, it meant the first real recognition by an Arab nation. And for ordinary families on both sides, it meant the possibility, however fragile, that their children might not grow up under the shadow of war. But peace is never free. Sadat's boldness earned him enemies at home. Many in the Arab world saw him as a traitor for shaking hands with Israel, and in 1981, as Sadat in a military parade, celebrating Egypt's strength, he was assassinated by extremists from within his own army, but the gunfire that struck him also struck the fragile hope of many. In Israel, some wept openly. They knew the man who had dared to cross the impossible line was gone. Did you hear before about the Lebanon War, a different battlefield just 1 year later? In 1982, Israel invaded Lebanon, and the aim was to expel the PLO, Palestine Liberation Organization, in which had launched attacks from southern Lebanon. But wars are never so simple. Picture Beirut, once called the Paris of the Middle East, its streets filled with music, fashion, and poetry, suddenly scarred by tanks, rubble, and endless checkpoints. Families fled their apartments with only a suitcase. Shops shuttered, and the sky glowed not with lanterns but with fire. Israeli soldiers, many barely older than teenagers, marched through narrow Lebanese streets, often asking themselves, "Why are we here? Are we protecting our homes or destroying someone else's?" For Lebanese civilians, especially Palestinians in refugee camps like Sabra and Shatila, but the war was a nightmare. In September 1982, and a massacre occurred in those camps, carried out by Christian militias allied with Israel. Though Israeli forces did not pull the trigger, and they allowed the militias in the world, recoiled in horror, and Israel itself was shaken to its core. Thousands of Israelis poured into the streets of Tel Aviv, demanding answers, demanding justice, demanding morality. The Camp David Accords signed in 1978 were not just ink on paper. For the first time, Israel felt the possibility of true legitimacy in the Middle East, but with hope came fear. In Israeli homes, families debated over dinner tables. Can we really trust Egypt? Will this peace last, or is it just a trick? Some celebrated Sadat's handshakes as a miracle, while others muttered that giving back the Sinai Peninsula was a dangerous mistake. For Palestinians, the deal was bittersweet. Egypt, their strongest Arab ally, had now broken away and recognized Israel, but what about their own state? Where was their voice at Camp David? They watched from the sidelines, invisible in negotiations about their own homeland. Sadat's assassination, a bullet to the dream on October 6, 1981. During Egypt's annual victory parade, Sadat sat proudly in uniform and decorated with medals. Soldiers marched by, jets roared above. And then, in a flash, soldiers from his own ranks leapt from a truck, guns blazing. The world watched in shock as Sadat, the man who had dared to dream beyond hate, feel lifeless. His widow Jihan later recalled how she whispered prayers at his side, while millions across the Middle East whispered, "What now?" In Israel, many lit memorial candles in his honor, their grief mixed with dread. If peace had cost Sadat his life, what would it cost them? Israel's tanks rolled north into Lebanon, and the official goal? Push the PLO back from the border and protect Israeli towns from rocket fire. But what was meant to be a swift military operation turned into years of entanglement. Lebanese mothers wept as shells fell on Beirut. Palestinian refugees, already displaced once before, found themselves trapped again. Israeli soldiers wrote letters home, their words trembling with doubt. "We were told we are here to defend Israel, but we are in someone else's country. When will this end?" The Sabra and Shatila massacre became the darkest stain. But Christian militias stormed the camps, slaughtering civilians. Though Israeli troops stood outside, the world accused them of complicity. Even inside Israel, outrage erupted. And more than 400,000 Israelis filled the streets of Tel Aviv, chanting, "Not in our name." The first time, Israel-owned citizens rose in massive protest, enforcing their government to confront its choices. An Israeli inquiry and found Defense Minister Ariel Sharon indirectly responsible, and he was forced to resign. In Washington, U.S. leaders questioned their allies' judgment, torn between defending Israel and condemning the humanitarian disaster. In Arab capitals, anger surged. Protesters shouted, "But Beirut is burning and the world is silent." However, in Europe, newspapers carried haunting images of rubble, burnt-out cars, and children clutching tattered dolls in refugee camps. The war did not just divide Israelis and Arabs, it divided Israelis among themselves, Palestinians among themselves, and the entire international community. But amid the rubble, something new was quietly growing. In Gaza's refugee camps, in the streets of Nablus, Ramallah, and Hebron, Palestinian youngsters began organizing small acts of defiance and boycotts, moves, throwing stones at soldiers. This was the first intifada, still years away, but its heartbeat began in the 1980s. Unlike wars between armies, this would be an uprising of ordinary people, fueled not by leaders in distant capitals, but by each day, frustration of checkpoints, land seizures, and the feeling of being voiceless. The 1980s were not just a bridge between peace and war, they were the storm itself. Imagine standing at Sadat's funeral, feeling the weight of a dream buried with him. Then imagine walking through Beirut, smelling the acrid smoke, seeing the faces of children who could not understand why they were hated. And then picture the streets of Tel Aviv, where Jewish mothers and fathers shouted against their own leaders, demanding morality over might. This is the paradox of the Jewish people's journey in the 1980s, celebrated for daring peace, condemned for acts of war, and internally torn between survival and conscience. It was a decade that whispered of what could be, and screamed of what should never happen again. It began quietly, unexpectedly in December 1987. In Gaza, a simple road accident where an Israeli truck collided with Palestinian workers' cars became the spark. 4 Palestinians were killed. But for many, this was not just a tragic accident. It felt like the breaking point after years of occupation, frustration, and silence. The funeral swelled with grief and anger. And in the days that followed, but something extraordinary happened. The streets themselves seemed to rise. Palestinian boys, no older than 12 or 13, stood defiantly at alleyways. With only stones in their hands, they faced down heavily armed Israeli soldiers. The world watched, images of slingshots against rifles, of keffiyeh-clad youth throwing rocks at tanks, began flashing across television screens. For the first time, the conflict was not only fought with guns, but with symbols. A child and a stone became more powerful than an army. This was the first intifada, the shaking off. It was not led by distant leaders or armies. It was led by shopkeepers refusing to open their stores, by school teachers holding secret classes after Israeli closures, by mothers banging pots from balconies to alert neighbors of army raids. It was grassroots. Ordinary people, who had been invisible in political negotiations, now made themselves impossible to ignore. Israel's reaction was harsh. Soldiers were instructed to use force, might, and beatings to restore order. But every act of suppression was filmed, photographed, and broadcast to a global audience. The first time, Palestinian struggle was no longer hidden behind closed borders. CNN, BBC, and international journalists delivered the intifada into Western living rooms. Viewers in Europe, America, and beyond watched in shock, boys with broken arms, women being dragged in the streets, funerals with endless rows of younger bodies wrapped in flags. Suddenly, the Palestinian story was not just about geopolitics, it became about human rights. Ordinary people began to see it as a moral struggle, an oppressed people crying out against a powerful occupier. Within Israel, the intifada created turmoil. Soldiers, and barely older than the Palestinians they confronted, were ordered to break bones, disperse protests, and control entire cities. Many wrote home with heavy hearts. I became a soldier to defend my country. But today I broke the arm of a child. Is this who I am now? Israeli society split in two. Some argued for stronger crackdowns, saying security came first. Others began to question if occupation was worth the moral cost. Peace groups like Peace Now grew louder and holding vigils with candles, demanding negotiations. In 1988, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, PLO, under Yasser Arafat, made a bold move. From his exile in Tunisia, Arafat declared that the Palestinians recognized Israel's right to exist and called for a state solution. For decades, the PLO had been labeled as terrorists. But now, Arafat appeared at the United Nations, speaking of peace and statehood. The world began to shift. Suddenly, the Palestinian cause had diplomatic legitimacy. Israel was reluctant, but the cracks were forming. The end of the Cold War, a new world order. By the early 1990s, the Cold War ended. And the United States, or the Soviet Union, once locked in rivalry, now looked toward global stability. For the first time, both superpowers agreed peace in the Middle East was essential. The stage was being set for something unthinkable, direct talks between Israelis and Palestinians. The first intifada was not just stones against tanks. It was the cry of a people saying, "See us. Hear us, we exist." It was mothers protecting children, the children daring to challenge soldiers, and the soldiers questioning their own reflection in the mirror. And it was the moment when the world the first time began to see this conflict, not just as politics but as humanity, bruised, beaten, but still unbroken. And as the Cold War thawed, a new door cracked open. The question was, would anyone dare step through? The Oslo Accords, shaking hands with history in 1993 to 2000, it is hard to believe, but one of the most famous peace deals of the 20th century began not in Washington or Jerusalem, but in a quiet villa outside Oslo, Norway. In 1992, while violence still smoldered in Gaza and the West Bank, a small group of Israeli academics and Palestinian representatives began meeting in secret. At first, they were not even official diplomats, just people who believed that words might be stronger than bullets. The atmosphere was tense, the men who had seen each other only as enemies. Now, sitting at the same table, sipping tea, searching for words softer than the anger in their hearts. We did not shake hands at first. We did not even look each other in the eye. But after weeks of talking or eating meals together, as we began to see each other as people, on September 13, 1993, the world held its breath. In Washington, D.C., United States President Bill Clinton stood smiling on the White House lawn. To his right, Yitzhak Rabin, and the Israeli Prime Minister, is a former general with a reputation for toughness. To his left, Yasser Arafat, the Palestinian leader long branded as a terrorist, and then it happened. Rabin extended his hand, Arafat took it. Cameras clicked, the world cheered. For the first time in history, Israeli and Palestinian leaders stood facet by facet and promising peace. Palestinians might advantage confined self-rule in Gaza and components of the West financial institution. Israel might understand the PLO because the valid representative of the Palestinian people. Both sides pledged to move towards a nation solution. The moment felt electric. Hope filled the air like oxygen. For many, it felt as although a century of bloodshed might finally give way to peace. As a part of the deal, the Palestinian Authority, PA, was created for the first time, and Palestinians could govern parts of their personal land. Schools, hospitals, and police forces started out to operate under Palestinian control. In Gaza, crowds filled the streets waving flags, singing songs, and welcoming home leaders who had been in exile for decades. And Arafat himself returned to Gaza in 1994, greeted like a hero. For Palestinians, and it felt just like the starting of statehood. For Israelis, it felt like a step toward security. The shadows of doubt, but hope is fragile. And not everyone celebrated. In Israel, many on the right felt betrayed, and they believed Rabin had handed over land to sworn enemies in Palestine. Groups like Hamas rejected Oslo and calling it a trap, insisting that all of historic Palestine must be free, but violence did not end. And suicide bombings by Hamas rocked Israeli cities. Settlers in the West Bank resisted the idea of giving up land. And then in November 1995, tragedy struck. Yitzhak Rabin was assassinated by an Israeli. extremist during a peace rally in Tel Aviv, but the man who shook Arafat's hand was killed not by an enemy, and by one of his own. The peace process wavered like a candle struggling in the wind. Through the 1990s and more agreements followed. Oslo II, 1995, the Wye River Memorandum in 1998. The leaders gathered and signed papers, shook hands. Yet on the ground also mistrust deepened, settlements expanded. Checkpoints increased, violence continued. Palestinians began to wonder, were these agreements real progress or just words on paper? Still, and many ordinary people clung to hope. Also, they remembered that handshake and that moment when enemies became partners, if only for a day. By the late 1990s, the promise of Oslo had dimmed. Palestinians still lived under checkpoints and restrictions. Israeli settlements were expanding across the West Bank, and ordinary people on both sides felt the peace process had stalled. Then came the spark. The spark in Jerusalem. On September 28, 2000, Israeli opposition leader Ariel Sharon visited the Temple Mount, Haram al-Sharif in Jerusalem, one of the most sensitive religious sites in the world. To Jews, it was the site of their ancient temple. To Muslims, it was the location of Al-Aqsa Mosque, the one-third holiest site in Islam. Sharon's visit, surrounded by hundreds of Israeli police, was seen by Palestinians as a deliberate provocation. The next day, protests erupted. Stone throwing by Palestinians was met with live bullets by Israeli forces. The violence spread quickly across Jerusalem, the West Bank, and Gaza. This was the beginning of the Second Intifada, a violent uprising that could remain almost 5 years. Unlikely the First Intifada in 1987 to 1993, which is marked by mass protests, and the Second Intifada was far bloodier, but suicide bombings by means of Palestinian militants ripped through buses, eating places, and markets in Israeli cities like Tel Aviv, Haifa, and Jerusalem. Israeli airstrikes, raids, and targeted assassinations struck Palestinian cities, and refugee camps for daily life became a cycle of fear, and parents hesitated to send children to school. Although commuters feared stepping onto buses in Gaza and the West Bank, neighborhoods were reduced to rubble. However, in between 2000 and 2005, an expected 3,000 Palestinians and 1,000 Israelis lost their lives. Countless more were injured, orphaned, or traumatized. The wall that divided as violence escalated. Israel started building a massive separation barrier within the West Bank in 2002 to Israelis. It was a security fence meant to stop suicide bombers to Palestinians. It was an apartheid wall carving up their land, cutting farmers off from fields, families from each other, and towns from trade. The wall became a symbol of protection to one side, of oppression to the other. A new Israeli strategy during this period, Ariel Sharon rose to power as prime minister. His government took a hardline approach, targeted killings of Hamas and other militant leaders, reoccupation of major Palestinian cities during Operation Defensive Shield, 2002, siege tactics around Arafat's compound in Ramallah, where the Palestinian leader lived under virtual house arrest until his death in 2004. To Palestinians, it felt like Oslo's dream of statehood was gone. To Israelis, Sharon's policies brought a sense of restored security, but at a heavy cost. The human side of the conflict being a child in Jerusalem currently. One day you are sitting in a cafe with your parents. The next day that same cafe is gone. Or imagine being a teenager in Gaza. Your home destroyed, your brothers taken away at night, yet your heart still pounding with anger and grief. The Second Intifada left wounds not only on the land, but deep in the souls of people. Trust, already fragile, was shattered. The world watched in horror, and news channels broadcast daily images of buses blown apart, homes demolished, children weeping. The United States, the Europe, and Arab states all tried to intervene. Plans were drawn, roadmaps suggested, but violence drowned out diplomacy. Even moderate voices on both sides were silenced by the chaos and the extremist armed groups in Palestine. Hardliners in Israel grew stronger. By 2005, exhaustion set in. The violence had drained both societies. Palestinians had lost Arafat, who died in November 2004, under mysterious circumstances in Paris, and Israelis were weary of endless bombings. However, in 2005, Sharon made a bold move: the unilateral withdrawal from Gaza. and Israel dismantled all settlements there and pulled out its military forces, though it kept tight control of Gaza's borders and airspace. It was a dramatic gesture, but it did not end the conflict. My friend, the Second Intifada was not just a chapter of war. It was a breaking of hope. The handshake on the White House lawn just a few years before felt like a distant dream. Where once there was cautious optimism, now there was fire, rubble, and grief. Both Israelis and Palestinians buried not just their dead, but their trust. The wall rose higher, the hatred cut deeper. And yet, even in the darkest moments, some still whispered, and there must be another way. However, Gaza disengagement and the rise of Hamas in 2005 to 2009, in August 2005, the world watched something unthinkable. Israel, and under Prime Minister Ariel Sharon, dismantled all 21 settlements in Gaza and withdrew every soldier. 9,000 Israeli settlers were uprooted, many dragged away by soldiers in scenes that shook the nation. For Palestinians, it changed into a bittersweet moment in one side. Gaza changed into free of Israeli settlements for the primary time in decades, and the alternative side. Israel nevertheless managed the border's airspace and sea, leaving Gaza and reduce off from the arena. The disengagement was meant to reduce conflict. Instead of it created a power vacuum and the rise of Hamas in January 2006. Palestinian politics shocked the world. But the militant group Hamas, long known for its armed resistance and suicide bombings, and won a sweeping victory in parliamentary elections. Hamas promised resistance against Israel, clean governance compared to the corruption of the Palestinian Authority, PA. However, the protection of Islamic values for many ordinary Palestinians frustrated by poverty, checkpoints and failed promises, and Hamas seemed like the answer. But to Israel and the United States and the Europe, Hamas was a terrorist organization, and stage was set for confrontation. A divided land soon. Tensions between Hamas and the rival Fatah party, it is loyal to Mahmoud Abbas and the PA, boiled over. In 2007, after months of clashes, Hamas seized full control of Gaza in a brief but brutal civil war. Fatah retreated to the West Bank, where the Palestinian Authority remained dominant. From that moment on, Palestinians had two governments, Hamas in Gaza, PA, Fatah in the West Bank. This division weakened the Palestinian cause and complicated every peace effort. The rockets begin with Hamas in control. Also, Gaza became the focal point of the conflict, however. Hamas and other militant groups began firing rockets into southern Israel and crude but terrifying weapons that sent families rushing to bomb shelters. And Israel responded with airstrikes, blockades, and targeted assassinations. In 2008, the situation escalated into a full-blown war operation lead in the time of 2008-2009. In December 2008, after rocket fire intensified, Israel launched a massive military offensive in Gaza called Operation Castlade. For 3 weeks, Gaza was bombarded from the air and invaded by ground forces. Israel claimed it was defending its citizens from rockets. Palestinians described it as collective punishment, as thousands of homes and schools were destroyed. The human toll was devastating. Around 1,400 Palestinians were killed, many of them civilians. 13 Israelis also lost their lives. Much of Gaza's fragile infrastructure was reduced to rubble. The images of destruction shocked the world, and children pulled from the ruins. The families fleeing with nothing and cities left in ruins. You just imagine being a child in Gaza in 2008, where the sound of drones is constant, the night sky glowing with explosions, and your school is gone. Your street filled with rubble. Also, you cling to your mother's hand, hoping tomorrow will be quieter, and being a teenager in southern Israel. Every siren sends you sprinting for shelter. Every day you wonder if the next rocket will land on your street. Both sides lived in fear. Both sides buried their dead. International outrage grew. Human rights organizations accused Israel of using disproportionate force, and others condemned Hamas for firing rockets from civilian areas. However, protests erupted across Europe, Middle East, and the United States, yet the conflict remained unresolved. The battle ended in January 2009 with a delicate ceasefire. Gaza turned into shattered, and the people trapped between siege and depression. And Gaza in those years became greater than a strip of land. It became a symbol of suffering, resilience, and endless war. Israel believed withdrawal would bring peace, but instead it brought rockets. Palestinians hoped freedom would come, but instead they faced blockade and division. And in the smoke of war, Hamas rose, not just as a movement, but as the ruling power of Gaza. The question haunted everyone. Was this the beginning of liberation, or another prison, this time without walls? The Arab Spring and shifting tides in 2010 to 2014, that time a fire spreads across the Arab world. In 2010, a single street vendor in Tunisia lit himself on fire after being humiliated by police and spark. Ignited an inferno. Protests toppled dictators in Tunisia, Egypt, Libya, and Yemen. Ordinary people, from students to farmers, poured into streets chanting, "Bread, freedom, dignity." The world called it the Arab Spring, a new dawn for the Middle East. But for Israel and the Palestinians, this dawn was complicated. Egypt's earthquake. Egypt, Israel's most important Arab neighbor, was rocked. President Hosni Mubarak, who had ruled for 30 years and kept peace with Israel, was forced to resign after massive protests. For Israel, Mubarak's fall was terrifying. Egypt had the Arab world's strongest army. In 1979 peace treaty with Israel was the cornerstone of regional stability. When the Islamist Muslim Brotherhood briefly came to power in 2012, and Israel feared the peace might collapse. In Gaza, Hamas itself, an offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood, celebrated. For them, the Arab Spring felt like their moment. For Palestinians, the Arab Spring sparked hope. They watched young Arabs demand freedom and wondered, could our time be next? In the West Bank, the small protests demanded unity between Hamas and Fatah. In Gaza, some saw the revolutions as proof that dictators could fall, occupation could too. But while Arab youth toppled leaders and the Palestinian divide deepened, Hamas and Fatah still could not reconcile. However, Syria's tragedy. In Syria, the Arab Spring became a nightmare. Peaceful protests spiraled into a brutal civil war. Millions fled. Cities like Aleppo were reduced to ashes. Extremist groups like ISIS rose from the chaos. Syria's collapse was both a threat and an opportunity. Also threat. Hezbollah, backed by Iran, gained new battlegrounds near Israel's border. An opportunity. Israel could strike Hezbollah and Iranian targets in Syria under the fog of war. As the Arab world burned, Gaza exploded once more. In 2012, after months of rocket fire, Israel launched Operation Pillar of Defense. For 8 days, Israel carried out hundreds of airstrikes. Hamas fired rockets deeper into Israel than ever before, even reaching Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. For the first time, Israel's new Iron Dome defense system was tested in battle, and it worked. Dozens of rockets were intercepted mid-air, saving countless lives. The war ended with a fragile truce brokered by Egypt's new government. The Arab Spring redrew alliances. Egypt, under the Muslim Brotherhood, briefly warmed to Hamas. In 2013, the Brotherhood fell and replaced by General Abdel Fattah el-Sisi, who was cracked down on Hamas and sealed Gaza's tunnels. Israel quietly welcomed Sisi and seeing him as a stabilizing force. Meanwhile, the United America underneath President Obama pushed for renewed peace talks with Secretary of State John Kerry. Spent countless hours shuttling between Jerusalem and Ramallah, but hope it was short-lived. In 2014, the peace process collapsed again. Israel continued building settlements in the West Bank, and Palestinians grew frustrated with the lack of progress. Trust between leaders was at an all-time low for ordinary human beings. Everyday lifestyles remained unchanged. Checkpoints, blockades, and rockets, promises of peace that never materialized. The breaking point came in the summer of 2014. After the kidnapping and killing of 3 Israeli teens, Israel launched mass arrests in the West Bank. Hamas responded with rockets. Israel launched Operation Protective Edge, its deadliest Gaza war yet. For 50 days, about 1.5 months, the skies over Gaza burned. Over 2,200 Palestinians were killed, many civilians. 73 Israelis were killed, and mostly soldiers. Entire neighborhoods in Gaza were flattened. The world watched in horror as children sheltered in UN schools and families fled under fire. The hospitals overflowed once again. The cycle of war, grief, and fragile ceasefire returned. The Arab Spring promised freedom, but instead it brought chaos, war, and more division. For Palestinians, hope flickered, but reality hit hard. Their leaders divided, their land fractured, their future uncertain. For Israel, new enemies rose even as old ones shifted. Iron Dome brought safety, but not peace. And so, as the fires of the Arab world raged, Israelis and Palestinians remained locked in their own unending storm. Trump era, Abraham Accords and shifting sands in 2016-2020, a new president, a new approach in 2016. Donald Trump was elected as a president of the United States and for Israel. This was a turning point. Trump promised to be the most pro-Israel president ever, to undo decades of cautious United States diplomacy, to stand firmly with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. For Palestinians, Trump's rise felt like the world was tilting even further away from them. The embassy move. Jerusalem recognized in December 2017. Trump made a historic and explosive announcement. The United States would recognize Jerusalem as Israel's capital, and the United States embassy would move there from Tel Aviv, although the crowds in Israel celebrated with fireworks. Netanyahu says it is a historic day. But for Palestinians, it was a devastating blow, and Jerusalem was supposed to be their future capital too. And protests erupted across the West Bank and Gaza in clashes with Israeli forces, and dozens were killed. The dream of a two-state solution seemed to shatter further. That time Netanyahu's stronger hand with Trump in office, Netanyahu grew bolder. Settlement building in the West Bank accelerated. Israel passed the nation-state law, 2018, declaring that Israel was the nation-state of the Jewish people, which critics said sidelined its Arab citizens. Inside Israel, Netanyahu's popularity soared with the right wing, but opposition warned that democracy itself was being tested. Gaza on the boil, Gaza desperation boiled over. Thousands of Palestinians gathered near the border fence in what became known as the Great March of Return. Every Friday, the crowds protested and demanding the rights to return to their ancestral homes inside Israel. But Israeli snipers lined the fences and dozens were killed in a single day. Hundreds over months, images of children waving flags through smoke and tear gas filled TV screens worldwide. For Palestinians, it was a cry for dignity. For Israel, it was framed as a threat orchestrated by Hamas. In 2020, Trump unveiled what he called the deal of the century. The plan offered Palestinians limited autonomy, but no real sovereignty. Israel would keep control of Jerusalem. Israel could annex parts of the West Bank, a patchwork Palestinian state surrounded and divided, but Palestinians immediately rejected it and says it a betrayal. For them, it was not a peace deal, it was surrender. But Israel welcomed it. For Netanyahu, it was confirmation that the United States stood firmly on his side. Then, a surprise twist in August 2020. The Trump announced Abraham Accords and peace agreements between Israel and Arab states. United Arab Emirates and Bahrain signed first, and later then Sudan and Morocco joined. For the first time in decades, the Arab states openly normalized relations with Israel, and embassies opened flights connected Tel Aviv to Abu Dhabi and Dubai. Business deals flourished. Netanyahu declared it a new Middle East. Trump celebrated it as one of his greatest achievements. But Palestinians felt abandoned. For generations, the Arab leaders had promised not to make peace with Israel until Palestinians were free. Now, one by one, those promises fell away. In Gaza and the West Bank, people asked bitterly, "Are we forgotten?" These years were years of contradictions. Israel celebrated as old enemies became new allies. Palestinians mourned as their cause seemed to vanish from Arab priorities. Trump's bold moves changed the map, but not the wounds. Jerusalem glowed with fireworks and flags, while Gaza burned with protests and grief. A world is in lockdown in 2020. The world shut down and COVID-19 spread fear and silence across the globe. Israel went into strict lockdowns. Empty synagogues, deserted streets in Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. However, the soldiers patrolling to enforce curfews. The high-tech nation moved fast and vaccines were secured early. By late 2020, Israel led the world in vaccinations. But there was a darker side. Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza struggled. Supplies were scarce. Vaccines came late. The divide between Israel and Palestine grew sharper, even in a pandemic. Even as the virus spread, Israeli politics boiled. Netanyahu faced corruption trials, protesters gathered outside his home and banging pots, pans, or demanding he resign, yet he clung to power. Settlement building quietly expanded. Palestinian homes were demolished, citing illegal construction. Frustration grew, even as people battled sickness. In May 2021, the silence of lockdown had broken, and in East Jerusalem, the Israeli police clashed with Palestinian worshippers at Al-Aqsa Mosque during Ramadan. And images of stun grenades in the holy site spread like wildfire, or across the Muslim world, with anger erupted. On the same time, Palestinian families in Sheikh Jarrah, a neighborhood in East Jerusalem, faced eviction. For many, it felt like history repeating. Another forced displacement, Gaza explodes in the 2021 war. The tension boiled over into war. Hamas fired rockets toward Jerusalem and Tel Aviv. Sirens wailed as Israelis rushed to bomb shelters, and Israel responded with airstrikes on Gaza towers collapsed into dust for 11 days. The world watched. Over 250 Palestinians were killed. More than a dozen Israelis died. Families cowered under fire on both sides. Buildings fell, lives shattered. But the conflict ended where it always seemed to, with a fragile ceasefire, nothing truly resolved. Even a pandemic could not stop this struggle. When the world needed healing, the Holy Land bled again. As vaccines saved lives, bombs destroyed them. As some celebrated new alliances, others lived under fire and fear. The years of the pandemic reminded us. Viruses may not see borders, but politics always do. And for Palestinians and Israelis alike, 2020 and 2021 were not years of peace, they were years of survival. The political shifts and Netanyahu's return in 2021-2022, the fall of a political giant, more than a decade, Benjamin Netanyahu ruled Israeli politics. But by 2021, corruption trials and massive protests had weakened his grip. Opposition parties, from left, right, and even an Arab party, did something unthinkable. They united, not because they agreed on policies, but because they agreed on one thing: anyone but Bibi. And so, in June 2021, Netanyahu was forced out. Naftali Bennett, a right-wing nationalist, have become prime minister. Yair Lapid and centrist have become his partner in a fragile coalition. For the first time in Israel's history, an Arab party, Ram, joined the government. It was a sign of hope. Jews and Arabs could govern together. But the coalition was shaky, always one step from collapse. Struggles in governance, the new government faced enormous challenges, escalating violence in mixed Jewish-Arab cities. The ever-present conflict in Gaza and the West Bank, economic recovery after COVID. Meanwhile, Palestinians saw little real change. Settlements kept expanding. Military raids in the West Bank continued. Peace talks remained frozen. Hope turned quickly into frustration. However, it is time for rising tensions on the ground. In 2022, clashes grew fiercer. Jenin and Nablus became flashpoints of resistance in young Palestinians. Disillusioned with both Israel and their own leadership, they rose up in armed groups, and Israel responded with raids, arrests. Also strikes. The cycle of violence continued, unchanged, unbroken. The return of Netanyahu, and then came the twist. By late 2022, the fragile coalition fell apart. Netanyahu is the man many thought finished, and returned, this time stronger, with the most right-wing government in Israel's history. His allies were ultra-nationalists and religious hardliners, who openly spoke about annexing the West Bank and tightening control over Palestinians. For many, it felt like the dream of peace was slipping even further away. In the Holy Land, leaders change, but the struggles remain. The fall of Netanyahu seemed like an ending. Yet it was only an intermission. The coalition that promised unity fell into the same traps of division. And so the old lion returned, bringing with him not calm, but a storm. The land braced itself, for what was coming next would shake not just Israel and Palestine, but the entire world watching. From Jerusalem to Jenin, the rising violence of 2023 by early 2023, Israel was not only facing Palestinian resistance, but also tearing itself apart from the inside. Prime Minister Netanyahu's new ultra-right government pushed for judicial reforms that would weaken Israel's Supreme Court in Tel Aviv, Jerusalem, and Haifa. Hundreds of thousands of Israelis marched week after week. Protesters carried Israeli flags, chanting "Democracy, democracy." Pilots, doctors, students, and even army reservists threatened strikes. For many Israelis, the fear was not just of Palestine, it was of losing their own democracy. Meanwhile, Jerusalem burned with old tensions at Al-Aqsa Mosque. Israeli police clashed with Palestinian worshippers during Ramadan. Videos of worshippers beaten inside the mosque shocked the Muslim world, and the sanctity of one of Islam's holiest sites turned again into a battlefield. This incident triggered anger across Gaza, the West Bank, and even in Lebanon, the West Bank, and the refugee camp of Jenin became the heart of Palestinian resistance. Armed Palestinian groups grew bolder. Young men, tired of broken promises and endless occupation, carried rifles in the streets. Israeli forces launched large-scale raids, calling Jenin a terror hub. The raids left dozens of dead, homes destroyed, and a new generation even more determined to fight. For many Palestinians, Jenin was no longer just a camp, it was a symbol. For Israelis, it was a nightmare of constant attacks. 2023 saw escalations on all fronts. From Gaza, rockets were launched toward Israel. From Israel, airstrikes pounded Gaza in return. In the West Bank, raids grew larger and funerals turned into protests. Even Hezbollah in Lebanon fired rockets, raising fears of a wider war. And everyday lives in ruin. Amid all this, Israeli families feared rocket sirens at midnight. Palestinian families buried their children after raids and strikes. Hope grew smaller, while anger grew louder. The streets of Tel Aviv were filled with protesters waving flags for democracy, and the alleys of Jenin were filled with smoke, rubble, and chants of resistance. Two worlds, one land, both spiraling deeper into uncertainty. And 2023 was not a year of peace. It was a year when Jerusalem's prayers were drowned by gunfire, when Jenin's alleys became battlefields, when even Israelis themselves took to the streets, not just against Palestinians, but against their own leaders. The land that had carried centuries of faith carried, once again, the weight of anger, division, and sorrow. And yet, in every chant, in every tear, there was a plea for dignity, for safety, for a tomorrow where both sides could breathe without fear. The war of 2023 in Gaza flames. It was October 7th, 2023, that morning. Israel woke up to sirens, but these were not the usual sirens. Thousands of rockets rained down from Gaza at the same time, and Hamas militants broke through the border, storming into southern Israel. Kibbutzim, small farming communities, towns, and even a music festival turned into battlefields. Over 1,200 Israelis were killed in a single day, the deadliest attack on Jews since the Holocaust. Men, women, children. Even the elderly were taken hostage back into Gaza. The world stopped Israel strikes back, and the response came quickly. And it came with fury. Israel declared war within hours. And Gaza's skies were filled with drones, fighter jets, and missiles. The entire neighborhoods were flattened, and the death toll rose every day. However, the buildings crumbled into dust, hospitals overflowed with the injured, and families searched the rubble for loved ones. Israel vowed, "We will eliminate Hamas," but in Gaza, it was not only militants who died. It was thousands of civilians, trapped in a strip with no escape. The World Reacts television screens around the globe showed the horror. Israeli families crying for their hostages and Palestinian families crying for their dead. Protests erupted worldwide, and some in support of Israel, also others in solidarity with Palestinians. The conflict was not just in Gaza anymore. It was on the streets of London, New York, Paris, and beyond. So, the siege of Gaza, Israel cut off electricity, water, and fuel to Gaza. Hospitals ran on dying generators. Doctors performed surgeries by flashlight. Mothers begged for milk for their children. The UN called it a humanitarian catastrophe. But still, the bombs fell. The hostages inside Gaza, more than 200 hostages, Israelis and foreigners, waited in fear. Israel's government faced pressure. Bring them back. A temporary pause was arranged, a deal brokered by Qatar, Egypt, and the U.S. For a few days. Hostages were released in exchange for Palestinian prisoners. Tears of reunion filled Israeli streets. Tears of heartbreak filled Palestinian ones. But the pause ended, the war returned. By the end of 2023, Gaza was unrecognizable, schools and mosques destroyed, refugee camps bombed. More than 20,000 Palestinians dead, and many of them women and children. Also, Israel mourned its October 7th victims. Palestinians mourned, their entire world turned to dust, and the world asked, when will this end? In 2023, the Holy Land burned again. On one side, families clutched photos of loved ones kidnapped or killed. On the other, families clutched the bodies of children taken too soon. It was not just a war of rockets and guns, it was a war of memory, of survival, of identity. The kind of war where no one truly wins, but everyone carries scars. Gaza's night was darker than ever, and Israel's fear was deeper than ever. The cycle spun again, tighter, harsher, but in the rubble, in the grief, and in the protests across the world, one truth echoed louder than bombs, and the people of both, Palestinian and Israeli, are still waiting for a dawn that has not yet come. By early 2024, and Gaza was in ruins. Every news channel on CNN, BBC, Al Jazeera was filled with the same images: children pulled from rubble, Israelis crying for hostages, cities darkened without electricity. The world had seen enough. Protests filled Western capitals. In London, New York, Paris, Berlin, crowds shouted, "Ceasefire now!" Governments that once stood firmly behind Israel began to waver. Even the United States, Israel's strongest ally, started pressing for restraint. But ceasefire talks begin. Egypt, Qatar, and the United States pushed for negotiations. The demand was simple: free the remaining hostages and allow humanitarian aid into Gaza, stop the bombing. But both sides carried unhealed wounds. Israel insisted, "We cannot stop until Hamas is destroyed." Hamas insisted, "There can be no deal without lifting the blockade." Talks dragged on in Doha and Cairo. Some days there was hope, and other days it collapsed back into silence. Meanwhile, inside Israel, pressure was mounting on Netanyahu. Families of hostages camped outside his residence holding signs, "Bring them home now." Protesters demanded elections, accusing the government of failing on October 7th and of prolonging the war. Even within the army, and doubts began to whisper, could Hamas really be eliminated? Or it was Israel sinking into an endless fight? International courts began investigating war crimes. For the first time, Israel found itself facing not only rockets and protests, but judges and subpoenas. While Gaza burned, the West Bank simmered. Settler violence surged. Armed clashes in Jenin and Nablus became daily. The Palestinian Authority looked weaker than ever, unable to control the chaos. Some analysts warned, "We are not seeing two wars. We are seeing the seeds of a third intifada." So the time passed, and in 2024, the Holy Land was not only scarred but trembling. The world begged for peace, and the people, Israelis and Palestinians alike, begged for dignity, for safety, and for freedom, but the leaders remained trapped in the same iron circle of revenge and fear. It was a year when Israel began to question itself, and it was a year when Gaza is already broken and fell deeper into despair. And yet, even in this darkness, whispers of ceasefire floated, fragile, uncertain, like a candle in the wind. Would it last? Or would the storm blow it out once again? In 2025, Israel stands at a crossroads. Not just geographically, but historically, the past haunts it. The Exodus, the promise of a homeland and centuries of exile, persecution, survival, also the Holocaust, forever etched in Jewish memory. Wars fought for existence in 1948, 1967, 1973, and beyond. The present challenges it. Ongoing conflict with Palestinians. Political instability and deep divisions inside Israel itself. Global criticism and shifting alliances, and the future? Still uncertain. By now, Israeli society feels like it is split into three nations within one: the ultra-Orthodox, growing in population and influence. The secular Israelis, tired of endless wars, wanting normalcy. The nationalists, pushing for greater control over Palestinian lands. Protests fill the streets weekly. Some demand peace, others demand strength. The feeling of unity, once strong in Israel's early years, seems fragile. The world's changing role globally in 2025 is not the same as 1948, and the United States remains Israel's ally. But no longer unquestioning, Arab states like Saudi Arabia flirt with normalization. But Gaza and the West Bank remain obstacles. Also, Europe grows louder in criticism. Meanwhile, Russia and China play their own geopolitical games. For the first time, Israel finds itself not just a regional issue, but a global dilemma. Palestinians, too, are at a breaking point. In Gaza, an entire generation has grown up under blockade and war. In the West Bank, settlements expand daily and erasing hopes of a two-state solution. The idea of peace talks feels like a memory from another era. Instead of new discussions rise, one state or two. Democracy or control? Can Jews and Arabs ever truly share the same land? Israel in 2025 faces two roads. One door leads to continued conflict, more walls, more wars, more fear. The other door leads to reconciliation, painful compromises, but a lasting peace. Which one will be opened? That no historian, no politician, no prophet can say. The journey has stretched from the Exodus to this for moment. In the year of 2025, we have walked through deserts with Moses. We have seen kingdoms rise and fall. We have stood in the ashes of exile and the fire of rebirth. And now we stand together at the edge of today. The Jewish people, after thousands of years, remain unbroken, but also unfinished. Their story is not complete. Israel, in 2025, is a nation searching its soul. Between faith and politics, between memory and destiny, between war and peace, it must decide what kind of future it will create. And just maybe, the answer lies not in power or land, but in something deeper, the courage to imagine peace and the will to make it real. Epilogue. The journey that never ends. We began this journey in the deserts of Egypt, where an enslaved people dreamed of freedom. We walked beside Moses as the Red Sea opened. We stood in ancient Jerusalem, watched kings rise and temples fall. We wandered with exiles through centuries of darkness, persecution, and hope. We saw a people return to their homeland, only to find new struggles waiting for them. And together we arrived here in 2025. Across thousands of years, the Jewish story has been more than just wars and politics. It has been about survival, about faith, about the unshakable belief that even when the world forgets you, you must not forget who you are. But here is the truth. History never really ends. The story of Israel, of the Jewish people, of the Palestinians, of this land, it is still being written every single day, with every choice, with every step, with every dream of peace. As you close your eyes tonight and remember this, the story of humanity is not about kings and empires. It is about people, people like you, people who love, who fear, who hope. The Exodus was not just their story, it is our story. The search for freedom, for belonging, for peace, it belongs to every one of us. So, wherever you're listening from tonight, hold on to this truth. The journey of the Jewish people is not over. The journey of humankind is not over. And just maybe your story and their story are part of the same great thread. Thank you for walking with me. Thank you for listening. Until we meet again, sleep well, dream deep, and carry peace in your heart.